Good morning, all. I declare open this public hearing of the Joint Standing Committee on Treaties and recognise that we're meeting here in this room, at least, on the lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. These are public proceedings. Although the committee may agree to a request to have evidence heard in camera, or may determine that certain evidence should be heard in camera. I remind all witnesses that in giving evidence to the committee, they are protected by parliamentary privilege. It's unlawful for anyone to threaten or disadvantage a witness on account of evidence given to a committee, and such action may be treated as a contempt of Parliament. It's also a contempt to give false or misleading evidence to a committee. At this stage, I remind all present to please ensure their mobile telephones are switched off or on silent. In accordance with the committee's resolution of 4 August 2022, this hearing will be recorded and broadcast on the Parliament's website, and the transcripts of proceedings will be published on the Parliament's website. Those here today are advised that filming and recording are permitted during the hearing. I also remind members of the media who may be present or listening on the web of the need to fairly and accurately report the proceedings of the committee. Transcripts of today's proceedings may not be available in time to meet the deadline for questions on notice. Therefore, could you please keep track of any questions on notice so that you're able to respond in the time required to ensure the committee can meet its reporting deadlines. The committee will now take evidence on the Australia-India Economic Cooperation and Trade Agreement, and I welcome representatives from the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, the Department of Agriculture, Forestry and Fisheries, the Department of Industry, Science and Resources and the Treasury to give evidence today. For the Hansard record, would you please state your full names and the capacities in which you appear before the committee? I'm happy for anyone to start.
I'm Frances Lisson, the Chief Negotiator for the India Comprehensive Economic Cooperation Agreement from the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade.
I'm Richard Emerson-Elliott, the Assistant Secretary of the Free Trade Agreement Goods Branch in the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade.
Renita Ram, I'm an Assistant Secretary in the Department of Treasury looking after tax treaties.
Good morning, my name is Mr Timothy Sill. I'm from the Department of Industry, Science and Resources, and I'm Manager Trade Policy.
Morning, Brett Hughes with the Department of Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry, and I'm the Director of the WTO and Free Trade Agreements section.
Good morning, I'm Kim Rolston and I'm the Director of the International Law Advising Human Rights and Treaties section at the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade.
And I believe we have someone online who's going to introduce themselves. Mr.
Good morning. Yes, my name is Stephen Dietz. I'm the Director of the FTA Services Market Access section in DFAT.
Thank you, Mr. Dietz.
Good morning. My name is Paul Murphy. I'm Director of the FTA Service section, Affairs and Trade. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Murphy. Although the committee does not require you to give evidence under oath, I should advise you this hearing is a legal proceeding of the Parliament, therefore has the same standing as proceedings of the respective houses. The giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as a contempt of Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege. I now invite you to make a brief opening statement before we proceed to discussion.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the opportunity to address the committee on the Australia-India Economic Cooperation and Trade Agreement, known as ECTA. I also wish to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting today, the Ngunnawal people. Chair, ECTA is a groundbreaking agreement that helps secure Australia's access to the world's fastest growing large economy, provides Australian exporters a valuable first mover advantage, and supports the government's commitment to trade diversification. It deepens links with an important strategic partner and strengthens regional economic architecture. Importantly, it signals to the world a timely commitment by both Australia and India to rules-based trade liberalisation. Australia and India launched negotiations for a comprehensive economic cooperation agreement in May 2011, But in 2016, after 9 negotiating rounds, the parties turned their focus to the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership negotiations, known as RCEP. Following India's formal withdrawal from RCEP in November 2019, India and Australia agreed to re-engage on CECA, and negotiations were relaunched in September 2021 with the aim of concluding an interim agreement by December 2021. The interim agreement, ECTA, was signed on 2 April and tabled in the Senate on 4 April and referred to this committee, which initiated an inquiry, and following dissolution of the 46th Parliament, the inquiry was re-referred to the committee on the 1st of August. Chair, India is the world's 5th largest economy with a market of 1.4 billion people, a GDP of 4.3 trillion, and a growth rate of around 6.8%. It's the world's fastest growing large economy. India's youthful population, diversified economy and strong growth trajectory present significant opportunities for Australian businesses. An independent report prepared by Peter Varkeyes observed there is no single market with more growth opportunities for Australian business to 2035 than India. India is currently our 6th largest trading partner, and with significant complementarities between our two economies, there's considerable potential to expand two-way trade. India, however, maintains high average applied tariffs of around 15.4% and ranging up to 150%. By eliminating the vast majority of these tariffs, ECTA will provide a much more favourable environment to deepen and broaden our bilateral trade. ECTA is India's first free trade agreement with a major developed economy in over 10 years, and as a result, Australia will gain a valuable first mover advantage, securing preferential access while India negotiates FTAs with our competitors, including the UK, Canada and EU. Moreover, India's agreement to adopt Most Favoured Nation, or MFN provisions, for many services sectors and for wine ensures Australia will enjoy the advantages India offers future FTA partners in these sectors. The national interest analysis covers in depth many of the implications of the agreement for Australia, but I'd like to briefly draw the committee's attention to some of the key benefits afforded by the agreement. Under ECTA, 90% of Australia's goods exports by value will enter India duty-free, with 85% entering duty-free immediately on entry into force, and 5% subject to short-phase tariff elimination over 3, 5 or 7 years. Key products to benefit include resources such as coal, LNG, alumina, critical minerals, metallic ores and non-ferrous metals, manufacturing including pharmaceuticals, nutraceuticals, cosmetics, wood and paper products, and some processed foods and fibres, and agriculture, sheep meat, wool, barley, oats, seafood, a range of nuts, horticulture and pulses, oilseeds and hides and skins. There will also be immediate access to duty-free quotas for cotton and immediate preferential quotas for almonds, lentils, oranges, mandarins and pears. India will also reduce its 150% tariff on Australian wine above a minimum import price, phasing over 10 years down to 25 or 50%, and extend to Australia any deeper liberalisation it agrees in any future free trade agreement, including with our competitors such as the EU, UK, US and New Zealand. ECTA builds on the recently signed Australia-India Critical Minerals Investment Partnership and will provide a driving force in the growth and diversification of Australia's critical minerals and resources exports. These substantial goods outcomes are supported by commitments by both countries to enhance transparency in relation to non-tariff barriers, including commitments to make publicly available laws, regulations, decisions and rulings, boosting certainty for those seeking to do business in either country. Chair, India's growing middle class presents enormous opportunity for Australian services suppliers. Under ECTA, India will bind 85 services subsectors for Australia. That's a 43% improvement on their commitments in the WTO agreement, General Agreement on Trade in Services. Australia secured additional commitments from India across a range of services, including business services, research and development, communication, construction engineering, insurance, banking, education, hospital, recreation, sports, tourism and transport services, providing greater certainty for Australian providers in these sectors. In addition, under the Most Favoured Nation provisions, India will guarantee Australian suppliers across 31 sectors and subsectors the equivalent to the best treatment it accords to future FTA partners. This will benefit Australian suppliers of higher education and adult education, business services, research and development, communication, construction engineering, insurance, banking, hospital, audiovisual, tourism and travel. This means that as India implements new FTAs with partners such as the UK, Canada and the EU, Australia will reap the benefits of those FTAs. The establishment of a professional services working group for the facilitation of the mutual recognition of qualifications, licensing and registration procedures across professional services and regulated or licensed occupations will support services outcomes and lead to greater certainty for suppliers in both parties. On labour mobility, ECTA, including in the side letters, deliver outcomes designed to deepen our people-to-people links. Australian commitments are consistent with our existing visa settings and previous FTAs, including equivalent commitments on categories of entrant, length of stay, spouses and dependents. India is committed to mobility outcomes consistent with the best of its existing free trade agreements, with additional access for Australian contractual service suppliers and independent professionals. ECTA will assist recovery in Australia's education-related travel services sector through additional incentives for Indian students to study in Australia with post-study work visa outcomes, which commit Australia to maintain opportunities for former Indian students to live, stay and work in Australia temporarily and extend lengths of stay for those graduating in STEM. ECTA also establishes a work and holiday program for Indians coming to Australia with 1,000 places to be implemented within 2 years. India will extend any similar youth mobility scheme to Australia should it establish one with another partner. Australia will also provide India additional certainty on market access for its nationals working in the culturally significant occupations of traditional chefs and yoga instructors. Chair, ECTA delivers strong immediate market access outcomes for Australia and forms an excellent building block for an ambitious comprehensive economic cooperation agreement in which we hope to pursue further commitments in goods and services, address outstanding areas such as digital trade and government procurement, and pursue additional areas of cooperation. We look forward to continuing negotiations and securing further benefits for Australia. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Lisson. I assume that is the only opening contribution? Yes.
Correct.
And could I just ask, if you don't mind tabling or providing a copy of that statement to the committee? There are some committee members who like to be able to have access to that before we get the transcript version.
Certainly.
Thank you. So I'll ask a few questions and then we'll go around, starting with the Deputy Chair. Clearly, a lot of work and effort has gone into achieving this trade agreement over a considerable period of time, and it is described as an early harvest agreement, and you've described how some of the aspects of the agreement, particularly around the most favoured nation treatment, will ensure that other agreements that India is considering, any benefits under those agreements will accrue to Australia as well. But I just wonder if you could pick out a few sectoral benefits that will accrue to Australian exporters in 2022 and that will improve again in 2023 on the basis that the ratification of any relevant legislation does occur between now and the end of the year. So just going to that claim about it being an early harvest agreement, some specifics about those who are currently engaged in exporting to India, how they will benefit from the moment that the ratification and any relevant legislation occurs, assuming that does occur before 2022, and then how that steps up in 2023.
Yes, thank you, Chair. As I noted, firstly, in the goods sector, that on day one, on entry into force under the agreement, 85% of our current trade to India will enter duty-free, which means tariffs that range up to 40% for some of those key products that we focus our trade on will come in duty-free immediately. That will give them significant advantages over our competitors. For example, in sheep meat, where there's a 40% tariff, I believe, or 30%?
30%.
A 30% tariff. Australia will face a zero tariff, and all our competitors will face a 30% tariff, so because they don't have free trade agreements with India. So that includes New Zealand, for example. In other,
sorry, but
yes.
just on that, so sheep meat. I mean, I'm
Yep.
looking at the list of goods. Obviously, coal and gold dominate.
Yes.
In the list that I've got, which is some kind of top 10, sheep meat doesn't feature.
No, it doesn't.
So
No, it
presumably, so I guess what I'm asking is, yes, that's fantastic that sheep meat will suddenly drop to zero tariff. Is there any reason to expect that we will start exporting significant additional volumes of sheep meat to India?
Well, certainly the sheep meat industry are primed and ready to take advantage of that opportunity and see significant growth potential there. They have exported to India in the past, and they see an opportunity to quickly ramp up exports. If you'd like me to go down by value of current exports, so as you say, coal is the biggest current export item to India, and the tariff will go to zero on immediately for most kinds of coal, with bituminous coal phasing down over 5 years.
7.
And gold? I think India has made a point of saying no move on gold.
Yeah, LNG is the next one in terms of value. That one will have an immediate elimination of a 2.5% tariff. Alumina, a 5% tariff immediately reduced. Then we have gold, as you say, as the fourth biggest export. They treated gold as a sensitive item. I think it has sort of monetary significance and possibly taxation significance. So they preferred to have that product excluded from the outcome.
And I mean, wheat seems to have bounced around and has not been a significant export, but any benefits for wheat?
No, and as you say, wheat has bounced around. Wheat is a product that India wants to maintain self-sufficiency and doesn't import a lot of wheat on a regular basis, but does at various times import wheat to supplement production. They noted that was as a staple product was very sensitive for them, so they wanted it excluded from the outcome of the agreement.
So look, I'll pick a sector because of some of the other participants in today's hearings, and it seems like a good one to look at, and that is wine.
Yes.
So clearly there are some changes when it comes to wine, but there's been submissions to the committee that suggest those changes aren't likely to be of significant benefit, certainly at this stage, because of the way that our current export trade in wine is structured. So that in effect the sort of the minimum required price threshold means that the tariff reductions above that price point aren't really of benefit to existing wine exporters. Is that a fair assessment? That's certainly the assessment that's been put to us by some in the wine sector.
Yes, no, we're very aware that some in the wine sector are disappointed and would have preferred to have no minimum import price requirement at all. we do export at the moment a lot of wine in that very low price category. So India has never made liberalising commitments on wine before, so this was a new process for them. They have an infant industry there that they are trying to develop. That industry is very much focused in that low price range. So they wanted to not encourage imports in that particular price range in order to help their infant industry to grow. So they set a minimum import price of $5 per bottle. That's US $5 per bottle, and for the 150% tariff to phase down for wine above that US $5 point.
So the evidence that we've been given separately is that 98% of our exports to India fall under that threshold presently. So
Yes.
I guess coming to the point where I started,
Yeah.
like it would seem that while some of the things in this agreement guarantee that if there's further liberalisation as a result of agreements that India might enter into with other partners, well, at least our wine exporters would get the benefit of that. The benefits under this agreement specifically for wine aren't likely to do much for our industry as it stands.
As it stands, in terms of the current export pattern, there is, of course, enormous potential to move into the more premium wine market in terms of the big tariff advantage that Australian exporters will have over all of its competitors. And the most favoured nation commitment that we got from India was important so that we won't be undercut in the market in the future by any of our competitors either, if under their future free trade agreements.
Because this committee often is asked to think about the sort of trade agreement making process, and particularly the way in which negotiations reflect
Yep.
the input of the sectors that are affected, how would you describe the way that the negotiations on wine occurred from our side in terms of the way they were based on input from the sector? Because certainly the sector in this case is putting some evidence to us that they would prefer better outcomes than what's been achieved. So, I mean, I guess in short, like, to what extent was there good engagement between the negotiators and our wine producers about what would actually work for them?
We had intensive discussions with a whole range of representatives from the Australian wine industry. The outcome reflects the fact that wine is a very difficult issue for India. The fact that we're the first country to get any concessions in the wine sector is a result of us pushing very, very hard. And we pushed very hard for the low price wine, very hard for that. We pushed for no minimum import price, and if there did have to be one, we pushed for one being much, much lower than what we wanted, much lower than what we got. India wanted to have a much, if they had anything, they set a much, much higher minimum import price, which would have made really reduce the potential for us to use that concession in the future. So what we have is a result of a negotiation. It's not 100% what we want, it's not 100% what they want. I can tell you that wine was probably the last thing that we settled on at the end, and the most favoured nation letter, which is legally binding as a part of ECTA, meant that when we discussed with members of the wine industry, suggested that this was an outcome that was of value to them.
Okay. I'll ask another question, then I'll bring in my colleagues and I'll come back at the end. There's evidence in the NIA that Australia will forego about $500 million in what otherwise would have been tariff revenue on Indian imports out to 25-26, but that's more than compensated for in the view of the NIA by the the savings to Australian exporters, which are estimated at being $2 billion in the same time frame. Again, this committee has often turned its mind to the topic of independent economic analysis or economic analysis at all, as far as how we're able to assess the value of these kinds of agreements and the Australian community is able to assess the value of these kinds of agreements. We're not given comprehensive economic analysis in relation to the agreement, but we are given some estimates of that kind. How is that estimate arrived at? I mean, I can imagine that the $500 million in foregone tariff revenue is not hard to calculate. How is the $2 billion in savings to Australian exporters been calculated?
That's been calculated on current trade, looking at exactly what we trade now, and then looking at the impact of the reduced tariffs on that trade.
So the bulk of that is, I assume, coal and natural gas?
And alumina and copper ore. Alumina, yes, copper ore, a range of other resources, and it picks up, of course, all the agriculture outcomes as well.
Okay, so it sort of works. It starts from a position of looking at, average trade volumes by category over a period of time, and then just says, assuming that's maintained,
yes,
or perhaps increases slightly,
yep,
and this is what those tariff reductions would
exactly
represent in terms of cost savings.
That's right.
Yeah. Okay. I have a question from Senator Smith. I'll go to Senator Smith.
Thank you, Chair. I just had a few follow-up questions on mine. And the Chair asked a number of my questions, so thank you. And I also just want to acknowledge that this is a pretty significant first step in terms of our relationship with India when it comes to wine exports. I guess I'm just interested in terms of going forward, noting that this is the interim agreement, we've got the comprehensive agreement coming up. Do you think there is any room for change here? What do you see as the next steps potentially being in terms of these provisions?
Thank you. India knew very well that we weren't totally happy with the wine outcome, so it won't surprise them at all that we will want to look at that again. We have and we've been picking up on the infant industry sort of situation in India, and we've also included in the agreement a side letter on wine cooperation, and this is to help industry-to-industry links and to help grow their wine industry and to establish a degree of cooperation and understanding between the two industries, which we hope will help to us to find a mutually satisfactory way of deepening that liberalisation in wine.
Okay, and just noting the most favoured nation clause in that agreement, are you aware of India undertaking any other negotiations with other countries in other agreements which might go to wine? I mean, is that something which is looking likely to eventuate, or is that something much further down the track?
Well, we know they're very deep in negotiations at the moment with the UK and Canada, and they are also have launched or relaunched negotiations with the European Union. And I think we know certainly that the European Union will put a premium on the wine outcome, and so as probably one of our key competitors, it's important that we at least match what they get through that MFN clause to ensure that the EU doesn't come in and with deeper liberalisation than what we secured. So there are other negotiations that India may have in the future, including with the United States and New Zealand. Again, key competitors in wine and countries that we don't want to be undercut by. So the MFN clause should in the near term work well, and in the longer term could have significant benefits as well.
And my understanding from industry is the tariff reductions only really impact about 2% of Australian wine exports. Is that correct?
So if you look at the current trade pattern of wine below $5 a bottle.
Yeah. So that would account for about 2% of our current exports to India,
I'd have to look at the
would it?
precise figures. Do you have those?
We understand it's about 2%, but as that affects current trade, but it's a very high tariff, so of course only very low volume, very low priced wine can get into India at the moment because it's 150% tariff. So from day one, when the tariffs are halved, in some cases, or drop from 100 to 50%, then that opens up opportunities for higher priced wine. That's
I do understand that. I guess I'm just trying to get a sense of, in terms of our market versus our competitors, where they're currently importing wine and at what level. So if this is sort of affecting 2% of our current exports, do we have an understanding of, for the EU, at what value they're currently exporting into India?
I think when we're looking at what the MFN, we'd be looking at if the EU gets a lower import price, we would also get the lower import price. And if the EU gets no minimum import price at all, then we would also have the minimum import price removed. So it affects, so that the MFN commitment will apply to all wine imports into India.
Yeah, I understand that. I mean, I guess what I want to understand, though, is in terms of the value of the wine that our competitors generally are exporting, are they generally looking at the lower end of the market as well into India, or are they already geared towards exporting wine, which is, at that higher level of between $5 and $15?
I think that
you said that we like to export the lower value wine. I just want to know if that's what the EU is also doing. I imagine it is the case for New Zealand wines, but I just want to get a sense of that comparison.
Yeah, but I think as my colleague said, with the 150% tariff, then all exporters to India at the moment are focusing on the lower end because that's the only thing that gets a price that's even slightly reasonable for the consumers in India.
Okay.
Sorry, not to interrupt your line of questioning, Senator Smith, but just for context, particularly for the public, and you'll correct all these numbers if I've got them wrong in my head, but I think Australia, there's not a lot of wine that is imported into India, and Australian wine does represent a pretty decent proportion, something like 40% of that. But in terms of our own export trade, at about $20 million annually, I think it's a very small part of the overall export picture. And the problem for our wine exporters is, with China closing the door, the overall export trade has dropped from 3 billion to 2 billion, so it's dropped by a third. That still leaves our exports to India probably only representing about 1% of the total value of exported wine. But when you're talking about a market of 1.4 billion people, and in circumstances where wine is becoming is an emerging kind of beverage in a nation that's otherwise dominated by beer and whiskey, that there's sort of huge upside. But it's a tiny export market, even in terms of our overall export picture as it stands.
Yeah, it's a market that's seen to have future potential. Certainly not one that will immediately provide a diversification result on day one that will make up for problems in the Chinese market, but a market that is very useful and has big potential to grow. And so the wine industry representatives we've spoken to have been very keen to develop relationships with the Indian industry and the Indian regulators. They're keen to invest time and energy into the market, knowing they're not going to get immediate rewards, but that there is good potential in the future.
I know we looked at the UK FTA, obviously, with respect to wine. I think the evidence there was there's some 350 odd Australian wine producers that export to the UK, and some predict that as a result of that agreement that number will double. But in the case of Australian exports, wine exports to India, it's not only a very, very small by value quantity of trade, but it's also fairly narrow. I think there's some evidence we've got that literally 4 out of 5 bottles of Australian wine sold in India are literally the Jacobs Creek
Yes.
label wine.
Yeah.
So sorry, back to you, Senator Smith.
That's all right. I just had one more question, which was around that industry-to-industry cooperation. Could you just step the committee through the work happening at that level? I guess you mentioned it briefly, but...
Yes, thank you. In relation, obviously, there was the side letter that agreed to establish cooperation between our wine industries, and that was in recognition that, as we've just been talking about, it is a long-term proposition and it's a market that will take development. So in line with that, the Department of Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry has been working with industry through the peak industry body, Australian Grape and Wine, to consider the structure, priorities and sort of the next steps to establish this dialogue, and we'll be working to commence that dialogue during 2023, probably from mid-2023 on, but that process of establishing the priorities is still a work in progress with the industry.
Right, okay. All right, thank you, Chair. That's all from me.
Thanks, Senator Smith. I'm going to go to Mr Pike.
Thank you, Chair. I've just got a couple more questions on the wine issue, and sorry to labour that one, and then another one around general consultation. But just on, I'm just trying to get a better understanding of the Indian government's position in relation to the wine section of this agreement. Is the primary motivator for them the protection of this emerging wine industry that they're developing domestically, or is it, because I'm noticing through some of the submissions that have been provided by the wine industry that not just the federal government, but obviously a lot of their state governments see it as a bit of an easy revenue raiser and have imposed some rather large taxes on it. So I'm just wondering whether the sense of in the negotiations was that it was more around a good way to raise revenue, or whether it's more of a protectionist sort of stance from their government.
Thank you. Certainly, in our discussions, they only ever referred to the protection of the domestic industry, and never mentioned the revenue angle. I think if you look at, and certainly they introduced me to members of their industry who were very passionate and very, very excited about developing their wine industry, and we had a good discussion. So I certainly got an appreciation for that. But on the revenue side, there isn't a lot of, they don't import a lot of wine, not a significant amount of wine in terms of revenue. So while 150% is a very high tariff, and probably their highest, they do have reasonably high tariffs on lots of other products as well. And I think if you're looking at the revenue side, it would be more in the minerals and energy area, where there is a significant impact on revenue by reducing tariffs, so particularly coal and alumina and gold, as we spoke about earlier. So I think I didn't get the sense that wine was a key revenue product for them in that respect.
It's good to get that perspective. What prospect do you hold out, given you've obviously pushed back on them quite a bit in relation to the wine sector? What hope do you hold out as negotiations continue in terms of getting any movement on in that regard?
I think, as I said, it won't be a surprise to them that we will be seeking deeper liberalisation. And we are working hard on the cooperation side. So I think the best we could do is to ensure that we keep working closely in terms of helping them to develop their industry and looking at sort of win-win type outcomes in that sector as much as we can. And I think we'll certainly push that hard, and it's a bit hard at this stage to guess what the outcome's going to be.
No worries. And just a final one on the level of consultation. You mentioned the level of consultation that was undertaken in the wine sector in particular, but we've had another submission, and we'll have a witness later today who's outlined that they felt the consultation was lacking in relation to this agreement, and that it was a rushed process. How would you, can you talk us a bit through what the approach from the department was in consulting with industry, unions, etc., as you were developing and negotiating this agreement?
Thank you. Of course, the negotiations for this agreement started in 2011 and went on for many years, up to 2016, and then was paused for a few years while RCEP negotiations took place, and then started again in 2021. We got a good range of submissions from a whole range of stakeholders in the first negotiating process, and conducted lots of consultations. There was a public joint feasibility study that was done and based on modelling. In the 2021 period going forward, as soon as the agreement came, the announcement was made at the end of September, we immediately put out a call for public submissions on the DFAT website. There was a press release that went out. We specifically referred to the idea of an interim agreement by December 2021, which was the initial target date, and sought submissions then. So we got a reasonable range of submissions through that process. We also have sort of peak body consultations where we referred everybody to the call for submissions and updated them on where things were at and sought their input. And there was a peak body meeting. I'll just get the timeline. As a peak body meeting in on the 29th of October, sorry, the 8th of December, and there was also the ministers, the then Minister for Trade's Advisory Council on FTA negotiations, which was also with peak bodies, was held on the 29th of October and the 17th of March. So there was a good range of industry and other business, as well as other stakeholders, including unions, at those meetings where there was where advice was given, and we sought comments or submissions from anyone who was interested. So in addition to that kind of more formal process, we also, as like with wine and with other similar sort of product where there was sort of tricky outcomes, we spoke in great detail with particular sectors to make sure that either we had the best arguments we could to argue for liberalisation, and that was important to consult the industry to get the right arguments and the right pitch, and also to extract the best possible outcome in terms of what was possible for India and what was commercially valuable for Australia. So we had a number of, as negotiations went, we had specific discussions with the particular sectors who were affected by that.
Excellent. Thank you. That sounds very comprehensive, Ms. Liston. No more questions from me, Chair. Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Pike. I'm going to go to Ms. Chesters and then to Senator Cox. Over to you, Ms. Chesters.
Thank you, Deputy Chair. My questions are in an area slightly different. It just relates to the chapter in here around temporary migrants and the changes to the VET. Unfortunately, in our country, Indian nationals have been, a group that have been highly exploited whilst they've been here on temporary visa arrangements, in particular international students, but others on the old 457 visa. I guess in relation to this chapter, what discussions were had, and can you share anything about maybe the working group into ensuring that any workers who enter our country under new arrangements will not suffer the same consequences as previous workers.
I think that the agreement doesn't make any sort of changes to our existing visa settings. It's done within our existing visa settings, but I'm sure there's a sort of parallel processes going on in terms of ensuring those processes operate in the right ways. My colleague Paul Murphy, who's online, may be able to elaborate there in terms of what ECTA does vis-a-vis this kind of space. And as I said, I don't think ECTA actually doesn't change the way we do visas here. It just provides outcomes within the existing system. Paul, are you on the line?
Yes, I am. Just started the video. In terms of visa integrity issues, I think Home Affairs is probably just to answer those. But certainly within the conventional approach across FTAs to ensure that the commitments being made are very specific around aspects of temporary entry, but don't actually go into inhibiting the Australian workplace standards.
Sorry, Mr. Murphy, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we're just having a bit of trouble getting you. It might be best if you do just switch your video off, so we're just getting the audio with the bandwidth that you have, and if you don't mind just starting that again.
Certainly, sorry about that. So with respect to sort of visa integrity issues, I would defer your question to Home Affairs. But with respect to the commitments being made in the trade agreement, certainly there are protections enabled in the chapter agreement to ensure that all temporary entrants are arriving at working consistent Australian workplace standards and rules and other eligibility. The FTA does not intrude into those areas. It does make commitments around such as duration, stay, category, but in terms of satisfying Australian workplace requirements relating to employment, those matters are left to the Australian system.
So I note as well that there's, for the first time, there'll be about 1,000, is that correct, Indian citizens being able to apply for working holiday maker visas, and that, so why was the decision to go down that path? Will these workers, if they want it, be available to apply for an extension if they do a rural or agricultural component, that the 90 days, that these 1,000 citizens, will they have to do that if they want the extension? And then the final question around the working holiday makers is that, can they apply in Australia, or do they actually have to be in India to apply for this visa?
I might refer to my colleague from Home Affairs.
Yep. Ms. Chesters, we actually have Mr. Michael Willard from Home Affairs here, as it turns out. So unless Mr. Murphy has a problem, perhaps we'll just defer to Mr. Willard if you'd like to respond to that.
Thanks, Chair. Michael Willard, First Assistant Secretary, Immigration Programs Division in Department of Home Affairs. In respect to the working holiday maker visas, once they're in effect, Indian applicants would have the same opportunities that other working holiday maker visa holders do, so they can apply for a second or a third working holiday maker visa, subject to meeting the criteria for that visa. They can lodge those applications for the first visa outside Australia or in Australia. Generally, for the first visa, we see most applications are lodged outside Australia, and then subsequently for the second and third visas, they're lodged in Australia.
I guess so. There's a bit of a difference though with Indian nationals, in the sense that they are also to one of our biggest international markets, and what we find is they're on this journey from studying here, will graduate or move on to a sponsored visa by an employer, eventually they earn enough points to become permanent residents. And fast forward 8 years, a decade, we meet them in citizenship ceremonies. Some of them go that way. Do you see these 1,000? Is there any assessment or analysis being done that these 1,000 will be predominantly taken up by people who may already be in country, and therefore not really that cultural exchange, or of a kind of continuation on of somebody's stay here?
I'd expect most of the 1,000, or probably all of the 1,000, would be from applicants who are in India. So the requirements are for 18 to 30-year-olds. So I expect that would be people taking advantage of that from India. The second and third visas, of course, are only available once you're in Australia and once you hold that first working holiday maker visa. You're also correct that India features as one of the top source countries for just about every visa program, but notably students, and also our skilled migration and family migration programs are both, India is either number 1 or number 2 in terms of source countries there.
How do you suspect that they'll come from India? How do you know? Has there been any analysis done?
Just that the first working holiday maker visa is just about entirely taken up by people offshore. So across all of the categories that all of the countries that are eligible for the working holiday maker visa, it's an offshore visa for those cohorts.
So do you expect this to impact the international student market in any way if people now have another avenue in which to enter Australia?
No, I don't see a lot of crossover between the working holiday maker and the international student visa market. I'd also note that the 1,000 places in the working holiday maker program is a very small number in comparison to the student visa numbers, which are tens of thousands. So I don't see a huge impact there. I would note there are provisions in side letters to the agreement that provide for incentives for Indian students who graduate with first-class honours in STEM or ICT fields to be able to have an extra year in Australia after they complete their studies. So that's an extra year in addition to what's currently available on the temporary graduate visa. That may have some I would say marginal impact in terms of Indian students perhaps choosing to take up studies in those fields. And these are, of course, first-class honours in STEM and ICT, which are areas of particular skill shortage.
Ms Chesters, I'm probably, maybe make this the last one. I'm just mindful of how much time we have left.
Yeah, apologies, Chair. One more. So just on that note, So China is the other big international student market. Remind me, they don't have access to working holiday maker visas, is that correct?
No, China has a working holiday maker arrangement. It's been in place since around about 2015, I think. It was ancillary to the China FTA agreement.
And do you have any data on how many people applying for that visa are already existing students here in this country?
I don't have that data to hand. If it's of use, I could take that on notice because I think it would demonstrate that there are, I would expect it's a very low number, if any, but happy to take it on notice so we can look at the data in detail and just give you a picture of what that number actually is.
Yeah, I think that'd
be great.
Yep. Thank you, Ms Chesters and Mr Willard. I'm going to go to Senator Cox.
Thank you. Previous witness mentioned that Australia's biggest exporter is coal. I also know that natural gas is high on the list and the biggest export to Australia is refined petroleum. Is this expected to grow under this agreement?
I think India's energy needs, exist irrespective of the agreement. So it's looking forward, what we expect in terms of demand from India is much more in the area of renewable energy inputs, particularly critical minerals. They're very keen to change their energy profile and to develop their industry to for example, they want to become a bulk manufacturers of electric vehicles. So they're going to be really looking to a lot of the inputs from Australia in some of those other sort of energy areas. So we expect that, particularly under the agreement with tariffs reducing, that and hopefully investment flows, that we will get, there'll be more of those critical minerals exports to India. In terms of their demand for coal, it depends on lots of things in terms of other sources of energy, how quickly they can take to move to renewables. So we're not expecting massive increases in those areas, but it's I think it provides a bit of security. I think in particular for alumina, it's valuable to have that reduced tariff in terms of consistent supply into the Indian market. So I think that was an important outcome for that product. But no, we're not expecting massive increases, but we're expecting in the future to see big increases in the critical minerals area.
Okay, great. Also, India has a very unique approach to trade, and particularly free trade, and they've had a very devastating impact of previously forced British imports on their economy during the colonial era in particular. Did the Australian government do anything to address some of those concerns with respect to the history?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
I think the question from
catch
Senator Cox was just noting that India's approach to trade has been very conscious of, in some cases, the harmful impacts to existing domestic industries, and that was a feature of the relationship between India and the United Kingdom during the colonial period. And Senator Cox will correct me if I'm wrong, but she's essentially saying, to what extent do our negotiations in pursuit of fair trade agreements as well as free trade agreements conscious of those concerns in India? Is that fair, Senator Cox?
Yes, thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Sorry, it was just a little bit hard to hear. Clearly it's an agreement where India made commitments that it wanted to make, it certainly carved out some of the really more sensitive agriculture products which go to their important need to ensure good nutrition reaches its vast population. So some of those really staple agricultural products, it's maintained its quite protectionist stance in those areas, so that the free trade agreement doesn't step into some of those areas. So I think India's tried to ensure by carving certain sectors out that it's able to manage its market the way it wants to manage them. Going forward, I think it's important that we look at understanding their market and talking to them about where we can improve our exports or get further liberalisation without threatening some very important needs that they have with 1.4 billion people.
Okay, just one final question. Thank you. Were there any Indigenous inclusion chapters discussed during this negotiation? As I'm aware, there was a trade mission that involved some Indigenous businesses recently.
We raised a number of sort of cooperation sort of areas with India at the end of last year to put into this interim agreement, but the response was that they would be interested in looking at those items in the context of this full CECA negotiation that we're undertaking now. So there's a sort of a marker that we will be looking at a whole range of areas, including Indigenous trade issues in the CECA negotiations that are underway or just getting started now.
Great, thank you, Chair. That's all from me.
Thanks, Senator Cox. With the indulgence of the departmental folk here and my fellow committee members, we'll just continue on this. We had a scheduled break between 10 and 10:15. No, we didn't. We have a scheduled break between 10:30 and 10:45, but we'll just continue for a few minutes because there are further questions, and hope that the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry folk will allow us that slight delay. I'll go to Mr. Burnell and then Mr. Birrell.
Thank you, Chair. My question's just in relation to the logic behind the signing off of an early harvest agreement, interim agreement, versus going through with a full FTA, given the length of time it's taken us to get to where we are right now, and what effect that will have on our ability to deal with things like sensitive issues within the ag sector and getting outcomes that are favourable for our exporters here in Australia.
The logic was this was something that India suggested. They said this was something that they could do, and the idea was that there was certain elements that they could do in a short time frame, but they needed more time to prepare for other elements. And digital trade is one obvious example where they're waiting for domestic legislation to go through before they can engage. It's sort of part of their new FTA policy. What we found is that we have been negotiating with India since 2011. That there was a new sense of interest in doing free trade agreements, and there was a real sense that because of the complementarities between our economies, there was seen as a good time for them to start with the Australia Free Trade Agreement and then do other countries. For us, it was a new approach by India, which we found very interesting. Also aware that they had a long list of countries to negotiate with, and there was a sense that if we sort of waited for the perfect, we'd be shuffled right back to the end, and it may take a long time. So we did see, this is for the first time we've done this, we did see a logic in doing a first stage agreement and then addressing the second stage when India was more ready to deal with those issues. Certainly because of the very high tariff nature of the Indian economy, there was a lot of advantages, commercial advantages, in moving to a first stage agreement first. In terms of how we deal with the sensitive sectors, in addition to what we've already discussed about enhanced cooperation and understanding and industry-to-industry links, there's also it was a first stage agreement for us in that we didn't give all of the things that we have in other more ambitious free trade agreements with other partners. So there's areas where we know India has an interest that we can look at what we can do for them there, and that would balance what we hope we will get in other areas, including agriculture and those sensitive sectors there.
Okay, thank you. Just my last question that I've got today. The confidential items of trade, they rank third on our top 10 list of exports. Can you elaborate on what or how they are statistically reported? Because my understanding is that for the purposes of the agreement, they are actually entities that are requesting confidentiality, not the actual items that are being exported. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. Confidentiality is available for statistics and our trade statistics on request from a company, right, so as not to give away commercial in confidence.
But does that mean that, as Mr. Burnell's asking, does that just mean that that category covers a real grab bag of all sorts of different bits and pieces?
That category does, but what we can uncover, and we can look at the trade data from the other side, so we go to India's import data, which is available, and you'll find that a lot of that commercial in confidence is likely LNG.
LNG.
In the case of India. We can confirm that, but that's what I understand.
Okay.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Mr. Burrell?
Thank you. Just a couple of questions. Firstly, can you just give me a sense on where the free trade agreement started and finished in relation to dairy and dairy products?
Dairy was something that India quickly identified as very sensitive to them, and it goes to there are many small, very small dairy sort of arrangements all over the country, and there's a lot of really important production of nutrients and that are really essential to be distributed amongst a large number of people. They very quickly asked that dairy be excluded from the agreement, and we had a lot of conversation with the dairy industry about that, and certainly kept them informed all the way along in the negotiations, so they not only did they understand, but they also were able to give us some information and data and things that we would use as argument to say, look, we're not a huge dairy producer, or we're not a huge dairy exporter in Australia. Nevertheless, that sensitivity for India was maintained, and I guess we sort of understood that situation that they were in. It's something that we'd like to return to in the next round of negotiations. We were able to get some downstream products in the tariff elimination category, including infant formula and protein concentrates. So that was some help to the industry, but we're working very closely with them to really sort of refine and target our requests in the next stage of the negotiations, to try and find areas that do not in any way disrupt or threaten the current sort of system of milk, a milk distribution that India has, and instead target areas that are, I guess, supplementary or in a more processed sort of area. Yeah.
On the face of it, it does bear a similar profile to China in some ways, in that it's a huge population. It's got nutritional issues with its population, and also some food safety concerns. Yes. So that is the reason why our exports to China are so significant. In the future, it'll be interesting to see whether those concerns on the Indian side mean that they're interested in importing Australian dairy products.
Yeah.
And then my other question, just my last question, is just back to the wine industry, this difference between no minimum export price but the $2 US minimum export price. My understanding from discussions with the industry is that a lot of the Indian local product is between if it were to be compared, if we're talking about what competes with imports, is between the zero minimum export price and the $2. So the $2 to $5, which is the gap that we miss out on because we've got our current agreement says $5, is a gap that's not easily met by the Indian domestic product, and that in fact the putting that product on the market in India will actually increase the market, because it'll educate the wine buying public in India that this is a quality that exists at this price. Can you just comment briefly on that?
I think that that all sounds very familiar in terms of conversations that we had with India. And certainly, that $2 mark would be ideal. I think this is where the work on the wine cooperation side letter and discussing with the industry and working out outcomes that do benefit both sides is the best way to find some real improvements here. So we'll be following that up very closely.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Mr. Birrell. Just the final thing I would raise is that we note that within the Australian-UK Free Trade Agreement there was a side letter in relation to the exchange of trade data. When that's not the case with this preliminary agreement, I imagine it would be the kind of thing that we would certainly ensure was there in a fuller agreement.
Yes.
But I just thought you might comment on that, because clearly, it's good, particularly in the absence of independent economic analysis, it's nice to be able to know what actually does happen after the fact.
Exactly, and we've had discussions already with India on that, and we'll look at including a similar. I can't not call the UK letter on trade data, but we'd be looking at certainly making sure we have up-to-date figures, and it's important for both of us to be able to look at the usage of free trade agreements, what benefits they have. I mean, India's just as interested in that information as we are.
All right. Well, thank you all for your time, your extended time with us today. It's a very significant achievement with a very significant regional partner, and I think we're all conscious of that. So again, thanks for your attendance here today. If you have been asked to provide any additional information, would you please forward it to the Secretary within 7 working days. As I said at the opening, it is the witness's responsibility to meet this deadline in a timely manner. You will, as always, be sent a copy of the transcript of your evidence when it becomes available, and have the opportunity to request corrections to transcription errors. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
So obviously we're just hoping to clear the way for the Chamber of Commerce and Industry people.
Sorry about that.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I do welcome the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry to give evidence today. For the Hansard record, would you please state your full name and the capacity in which you appear before the committee?
My name is Chris Barnes, and I'm the Head of Trade and International Affairs for the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry.
Thank you, Mr. Barnes. Although the committee doesn't require you to give evidence under oath, I advise you this hearing is a legal proceeding of the Parliament, therefore has the same standing as proceedings of the respective houses. The giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as a contempt of Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege. I invite you to make a brief opening statement before we proceed to questions and discussion.
Great, thanks, Mr. Chair. The Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry strongly supports closer trade and investment relations with India, and we fully support the signing of the Australia-India ECTA. India is an important economic partner for Australia, and AI-ECTA will be our first free trade agreement between our countries. This agreement is the start of a new important phase in Australia's relationship with one of our most significant economic partners, and will see Australian business benefit from diversified markets and global supply chains. AI-ECTA will deliver greater market access for Australian exporters to a market of 1.5 billion consumers, and more certainty for investors in one of the world's fastest growing economies. Business played a key role in the negotiations, and we compliment Francis Lisson and the DFAT negotiators for the consultations. This has ensured that IA-ECTA is a commercially sound agreement. The agreement is more comprehensive than we anticipated at the commencement of the negotiations, and this is a credit to the negotiators. We must recognise that this is an interim agreement, and we look forward to working with the negotiating team on the Comprehensive Economic Cooperation Agreement, or AI-CECA. If AI-ECTA is ratified, then it will be important to work on the implementation to ensure that business maximises the benefits from this agreement, particularly in market access and investment. And the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry will be an active partner with DFAT, Austrade and other government agencies to ensure that business maximises the benefits in the implementation. In summary, the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry supports the ratification of AI-ECTA.
Thank you, Mr. Barnes. And as I did with the department, I'd ask if you're happy just to provide a copy of the statement that you've made to us today. That there are some committee members that would appreciate that. It just means that we have the benefit of those remarks in writing rather than waiting for the transcript.
Sure.
Thank you. As you say, this is a momentous achievement. I mean, to finally settle a trade agreement, even a preliminary trade agreement with India, considering its significance as a long-time friend of Australia, but of course as a hugely significant nation and economy in our region, cannot be underestimated. It is an early harvest agreement. I mean, I'm interested, as when we heard from the department, your perspective on the things that could constitute immediate benefits rather than the sort of the stepping stone or longer term benefits.
Well, we could certainly, we can already see that there's already market access benefits straight away, in that 85% of exports are going to be covered from day one. And we can see that 91% of exports will be covered within 10 years. I mean, that's a significant early harvest. There are also some very good measures in terms of trade facilitation, in facilitating that trade. And we also see some areas in terms of labour mobility that are also going to bring immediate benefit to Australian business. I point out the 1,000 places for working holiday makers. That's going to have immediate benefit for the tourism and hospitality industry, an industry that's suffered quite considerably during the pandemic.
Do you have members of the chamber that as part of your participation in the consultation process have made it clear to you that they can see either increase in export volumes or export value straight away as a result of those? I mean, we know that at the moment our goods trade is dominated by coal and gold, and it seems that there'll be some benefits for coal and potentially LNG, not for gold at this stage. Are there other areas that you've heard from through your membership where people really are saying, well, this is, we know we're gearing up for the way in which we'll need to respond to this by increasing Australian production or by shifting the way that they export from a a less attractive market to now a more attractive market in India as a result of these changes?
Well, we represent around 400,000 companies around Australia. We represent all of the state and territory chambers of commerce, and we also represent approximately 70 industry associations. So we have a broad section of membership, the widest selection of membership of peak business organisations in the country. So we represent a wide selection of industries, and as we can see from this agreement, there are a wide number of industries that are going to benefit. Obviously, when we look at IA-SECA and we look at the comprehensive agreement, there are obviously some areas of market access that we believe the negotiating team needs to draw some attention to, and that's already been covered in the session before this. But what I can also say is that the number one pressure point on Australian business at the moment is in terms of skills and labour, and certainly we're doing everything we can to assist our members, because all of our economic surveys are showing that this is the tightest labour market that we've seen for a considerable period of time, and so any measures that are put in place to address that would be beneficial.
In terms of trade facilitation and other issues that go to how Australian exporters actually get to make use of potential benefits through a trade agreement, one of the things that's come up through submissions and in the analysis of the agreement is around the way that India as a market operates, because like Australia, it's a federal structure, and that, you know, while a trade agreement deals with things like tariffs that are applied federally, there are state, union and national territory tax regimes in India that can separately add to the costs that are placed on imported Australian goods. And some of the information we've been given is that the way those costs fluctuate is hard to have visibility of, and sometimes hard to interpret. I just wonder if that's something that you have some insight into through input from your members about the importance of, you know, making sure that the benefits we get through tariff reductions at the federal level aren't to some degree offset by changes at the sub-federal level.
Look, in terms of trade facilitation issues, we look at those issues all of the time on behalf of our members on specific cases. You know, getting goods across borders can sometimes be a very difficult process. In terms of those sub-national issues in India, I'm not an expert on that particular topic. But I think one of the benefits of having an early harvest agreement is that once it's ratified and we see it being implemented, we'll be able to see what more we can improve, and we can then have another go through that comprehensive agreement. So I actually think that's a good process to follow.
I agree. You've already talked about the potential benefits to Australia from having access to skilled labour, and we heard previously that some of the emphasis we're placing on a greater openness from our side to students from India, for instance, actually puts weight on STEM qualifications and ICT qualifications, which I think is very sensible. Clearly, one of the things in, you know, all of these agreements are now trade and investment agreements, and sometimes we spend all our time talking about quotas and market access and tariffs, but the investment rules are also important. There are some changes in relation to, I believe, Foreign Investment Review Board threshold levels and things like that, designed to facilitate Indian investment into Australia, and it's expected that some of that investment will be in new energy, metals and critical resources, which is a big focus for Australia. I just invite you to offer any views you have about that, how important that is, how welcome that would be, and how that sort of opening up to increased trade in those areas is in our geostrategic interest if managed properly.
Well, if you go back to first principles, we're supporting free and open trade and investment between Australia and India, which means that clearly we're looking for increasing the amount of Indian investment in Australia, and this needs to be a partnership. And this is where a negotiation needs to be a win-win for both business sectors, and certainly we encourage that Indian investment here in Australia.
My final question before I throw it open to committee members just goes to an aspect that Senator Cox raised with the department, which is around sensitivities in India, particularly in areas like agriculture. Within this agreement, there is a safeguards agreement, and the safeguards agreement effectively allows India to monitor where there is a sort of an unforeseen surge of imports because of a tariff reduction or some other liberalising measure, and that surge of imports is determined to have a particular kind of injury or impact on a domestic industry. That then allows India to sort of trigger this safeguards measure and put in some compensating, I guess, illiberal measures just to moderate what that impact would be. Do you have any concern about the way those measures might undermine the value of an agreement like this?
Look, when partners go into agreements such as this, they must go in good faith, and there must be compliance with the rules, and we would just be encouraging people to abide by the rules.
Okay. Now, are there any other committee members who'd like to ask questions of Mr. Barnes? I've got none on the line. All right. Is there anything else you'd like to add, Mr. Barnes?
No.
All right. Thank you for your attendance here today and your work on behalf of all of the companies that the ACCI represents. If you've been asked to provide any additional information, would you please forward it to the Secretary within 7 working days? As I said in the opening, it is the responsibility of witnesses to meet the deadline in a timely manner. You will get a copy of the transcript of your evidence today when it becomes available, and then have the opportunity to request corrections to transcription errors. But thanks for making the time and your submission and being here today.
Terrific. Thank you.
Committee members, we've made up a bit of time and we will suspend now until 10:45 a.m.
Yep, they're all there.
All
We're
go.
good to go.
All right. Committee members, we will resume this hearing of the J. Scott, and I welcome representatives from Australian Grape and Wine Incorporated and Pernod Ricard winemakers to give evidence today. For the Hansard record, would you please state your full names and the capacity in which you appear before the committee? We'll start with the Australian Grape and Wine Incorporated folk, I think.
Thank you very much. My name is Lee McLean. I'm the incoming Chief Executive of Australian Grape and Wine.
Thank you.
Damien Graffanti, Director of Strategy and International Affairs from Australian Grape and Wine.
Thank you, Mr. Graffanti.
Byron Hodkinson, Public Affairs Manager, Pernod Ricard Winemakers.
Excellent. Thank you, Mr. Hodgkinson. The committee doesn't require you to give evidence under oath today. I should advise you, however, that this hearing is a legal proceeding of the Parliament, therefore has the same standing as proceedings of the respective houses, and the giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as a contempt of Parliament. The evidence you give today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege. So as we always do, I now invite you to make brief opening statements before we proceed to discussion. And again, I guess we'll start with Australian Grape and Wine.
Thank you very much. I'll kick off proceedings if you like. My name's Lee McLean. As I said, I'm the incoming Chief Executive of Australian Grape and Wine, and we are the National Association of Grape Growers and Winemakers, with representing businesses from right across the country, businesses of all different sizes and shapes. We support the ratification of the Australia-India Economic and Trade Agreement, the AI-ECTA agreement. I think it's important to note from the outset that the industry itself has faced most recently a period of significant strain in the wake of the effective closure of the China market to Australian wine exports. diversification and market diversification has been something that we've been heavily focused on in the aftermath of that. And obviously, exports to India, the potential that India presents to us in the future is of great interest to us, and I thank the committee for expressing its interest in this particular piece of work. While India is a really challenging place to do business, it has high tariffs of 150% upon entry, significant regulatory divergence between states and state taxes and charges. It's clear that, in my opinion at least, the opportunity presented by India, if we can get the right sort of economic and regulatory settings in place, are really significant and present a significant opportunity for Australian wine exporters in the future. And there has been some growth already, albeit off a low base when it comes to the Indian market. So we've seen between 2021 and 2022 a 180% increase in exports by value, going up from $6 million to $18.9 million over that time period. So there is real opportunity there.
So, sorry, Lee and Chair, I'm sorry to interrupt, but it's very hard to hear Lee on the video. There's some shuffling or some background noise coming through. I'm not sure if it's from the committee room or somewhere else.
Okay, thank you, Senator Smith. We're not getting that in the room, but maybe if other people online are getting that, I'm not sure.
Have people got their microphones
Perhaps if everyone could
off?
just be on mute, if you're not already on mute, and we'll just have Mr. McLean.
I think it's coming from the committee room itself.
No, I don't think that's correct. I'm looking at the participants bar here, and it's whoever's on VC 61020 there. I'm not even entirely sure what that is, but it's the one making the noise beyond Mr. McLean, who's doing very well given the circumstances.
Yeah, VC 6.
Apologies, that is the committee room on our screen. So when you hover over the committee room, that's you guys.
All right, we'll check that at this end. Thanks, Senator Smith. Sorry, if you do your best, Mr. McLean.
No, that's fine, and thanks, Senator Smith, for raising that as well. I appreciate it. So getting on to the actual AI-ECTA agreement, as I said, we are supportive of ratification of the agreement, albeit we note that there are some limitations to it, and that it is somewhat unusual in the fact that it is an interim agreement and that it is perhaps not as comprehensive and liberalising as many in the agriculture and drinks industries have seen in the past. But however, it does provide opportunities for high-value winemakers in particular. I'm sure everyone on the committee will be familiar with the tariff reduction schedule that's been presented under the AI-ECTA agreement. They reduce over time, over 10 years, at different gradients depending on the value of the wine in question. But there is a significant amount of opportunity there at the moment under this interim agreement for those high-value wines. And I think it's important to note as well that in terms of future opportunities, we note this is an interim agreement and there is opportunity for the Australian and Indian governments to work together to use this as a springboard for perhaps a more comprehensive and liberalising agreement in the future with greater coverage of tariff relief. That's certainly what we'd like to see. So what's I going to say next? The other point that I'll make is the most favoured nation status clause of the agreement. Now, this is an important clause in the agreement, something that we strongly support. I'm sure you're well aware, but for those who aren't aware of these sorts of clauses, effectively it means if someone else, another country economy, can come in and get a better deal from India than us, then we will also get access to the market on those better terms. So that is a really valuable thing in the agreement. Two other things I'll mention very quickly. The side letters that are part of the AI-ECTA agreement are really positive. They focus on things like information exchange, creating formalised sort of dialogue settings, regulatory cooperation and the like. These are really important things, I think, particularly in this interim phase where governments can start working together, regulators can start working together, and as my colleague Damien from Australian Grape and Wine is doing right now, it allows industry, it gives industry the imprimatur to sort of start working together to build that relationship between our two industry bodies and industries in general, to build some understanding about what the shape of Australia's wine sector is really like and how we can work together to grow that market for wine in total in India. And as I mentioned, Damien in particular and the others in the team at Australian Grape and Wine have been working on building that relationship. We hosted a delegation of Indian wine industry leaders to the Australian Wine Industry Technical Conference mid this year, and we have a delegation returning to India next week to continue that relationship and to hopefully build some goodwill for this next round of negotiations when it starts. So in conclusion, I'll leave it there. I'm very happy to take any questions that the committee may have, but in conclusion, we strongly recommend that the Parliament ratifies the agreement as soon as it can. We would like to see this agreement in place, and equally we'd like to see the Parliament and the Australian government to start really taking that next step to looking at what that next more comprehensive and liberalising agreement looks like. So thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Mr McLean. So I guess we'll take a statement from you, Mr Hodgkinson.
Thanks, Mr Chairman, and thank you for the invitation to appear before the committee this morning. Pernod Ricard Winemakers is the premium wine division of Pernod Ricard. We're a global wine business. We're headquartered in Australia, and we're the fourth biggest producer of Australian wine by value. We own and produce Australian wine brands, Jacobs Creek, St Hugo, George Wyndham and Orlando. But at our heart, we're an Australian agricultural and manufacturing business. We employ more than 800 people nationally, all of those in regional Australia, in the Barossa Valley. And we're here today because we have a particular interest in the Indian market. Since we launched Jacobs Creek in India in 2001, it's become the #1 Australian and international wine brand in India, making up 80%, nearly 80% of the Australian category and more than 1/3 of all imported still wine. At that, we want to put on the record that we were surprised and disappointed at the lack of ambition contained in the agreement. We think it represents a missed opportunity to open up a critical growth market at a really delicate industry. The fundamental problem with the agreement is that it reduces tariffs on just 2% of Australian wine exports to India. This is because the tariff reductions only wine above a minimum import price or customs value of $5 a bottle. To put this in context, the average price of Australian wine exported to India in 2020 was $2.53 a bottle. For wine above that threshold, or that $5 a bottle threshold, it would take 10 years for tariffs to reach a resting rate of 25 or 50%, which is still really high by international standards. For the 98% of Australian exports to India below that threshold, including the tariff rate will remain at 150%. In our view, the substance of the agreement is a little bit like launching flights to a new destination, but only selling seats in first class. The agreement also fails to remedy a number of discriminatory taxes at the state level. For example, the state of Maharashtra imposes a tax on foreign liquor set at 150% of manufacturing cost. And what the cumulative effect of these tariffs and taxes in the Indian market are is that a bottle of Jacobs Creek Classic, which sells for around $8 in Australia, costs between 20 and 30 Australian dollars in India. I also want to address the most favoured nation clause incorporated into the agreement by way of side letter between the ministers. On balance, it's positive. Given the tariff outcome that we got, it's better than MFN clause than not one. But I would say that given the dominance of the Australian category in India, if we were to end up having to rely on the MFN clause for tariff reductions, by definition, it means we're risking giving up our market, share in favour of other nations. The unavoidable context of the trade deal under examination today is the effective disappearance of the China market, Australian. The facts are that since tariffs were imposed on Australian wine by the Chinese Ministry of Commerce, the value of Australian wine exports have dropped 27%. The volume of Australian wine exports have dropped by 14%. Some grape growers are not picking fruit, with reports of some winemakers paying growers not to deliver grapes. And where growers are picking fruit, they're getting reduced returns because red wine grape prices dropped by 15% in the most recent vintage as a result of falling demand. There isn't a single market that can remedy the Australian wine industry's problems that are being precipitated by the China tariffs. But our firm view is that without substantially improved market access in India, well beyond what this agreement provides, there won't be an effective solution to the structural oversupply now hampering the Australian wine industry. The potential of the Indian market for Australian wine is significant. It may be small now, but it is growing fast. And when you consider that 19 million Indians become drinking age each and every year, you can begin to appreciate the scale of the opportunity. Finally, to be crystal clear, we do not oppose the ratification of the agreement. I do think it is important for the committee to note the significant shortcomings of it insofar as it applies to Australian wine exports and make recommendations on what a future final agreement should look like. Thank you.
Okay, thanks to each of you. I'll just ask each of you, to the extent that the opening statements you just made take the form of a document that you effectively read, if you are happy to email that through to the Secretariat in the course of today, that would be helpful. It just means that we have the benefit of that in textual form for our reference earlier than the transcript itself will be available. So that's, if you don't mind doing that, that would be appreciated. I'm going to ask a couple of questions. I know Senator Smith and Mr. Burrell have some questions too. And I guess I'll stay with you first, Mr. Hodgkinson, just because you're the best example of a sectoral representative who has a strong presence in the market at the moment. It's quite remarkable, really, to think. I'm sure I've enjoyed a glass of Jacob's Creek when I've been in India, but the fact that 4 out of 5 bottles of Australian wine in India are literally under that label is quite incredible as a sort of a form of sectoral concentration. Obviously, we'd like wine exports to grow significantly, and the potential there in future is enormous. If you think that at the moment it's grown to be about $20 million worth of wine exports, I think that would be about 1% of our total exports, and it would be much less than 1% if the value hadn't decreased by nearly a third as a result of the geo-economic measures that China has seen fit to impose on our country. One of the things that interests me is some of the evidence you've given us about what the reality is for your company with respect to that minimum price threshold, particularly the fact that you're not really in a position to sort of increase the notional price in order to push it into a category where you might get some tariff benefits. Perhaps you could just explain that a little bit to the committee.
Well, I think the shortest or the easiest way to answer that, Mr. Chairman, is that the Indian Customs Authority may take a particular interest in winemakers or exporters artificially inflating their customs price to take advantage of a tariff reduction. These transfer prices are set at a level benchmarked a range of criteria and documented by external advisors. So it's not typically something that you can just adjust at the drop of a hat.
And with respect to the, I mean, at the moment, one of the reasons presumably that less than 2% of Australian wine exports were over that $5 USD level would have been because of the tariff treatment. Do you think that there is some scope for your company and for wine producers and exporters in Australia to change that balance so that it wouldn't be 2% in future, that in fact these tariff changes which do affect sort of higher value wines may see an expansion of that part of the market?
Certainly we're constantly looking for opportunities to premiumise our portfolio mix in our export markets. So for instance, we might look at a fine wine brand like St Hugo to export to India, which may well be that minimum import price. I would caution to some degree though, because I mean, certainly for our business, we're a large global business. We own Pernod Ricard owns the distribution network in India. It's much easier for us than say a small or medium-sized enterprise who export their own fine wine to the Indian market, given the complexities contained within it.
Okay.
Can I ask a question there?
Sure.
Just given your awareness of these issues in some detail, what vehicle would we need to establish to, in your view, to maximise the opportunities, given this looks like the deal that we're going to have to accept at this point, which is not your ideal, but progress, as you indicated. So what vehicle necessary to really maximise the opportunity?
Certainly, I mean, look, it is under the interim agreement, and there's due to the negotiations in respect of a final agreement in the next 12 months or so. Certainly, I think the best way forward for the industry and for the government would be to have an agreement with India as part of that final negotiation that significantly drops that minimum import price and reduces tariffs or eliminates them within a certain period of time.
Thank you.
I'm going to go to Senator Smith and then to Mr Burrell and then to Mr Pike.
Thank you, Chair. Mr McLean, we heard from the department earlier in relation to the exchange of letters between our former Trade Minister and the Minister for Commerce and Industry in India around some of the work which would take place at an industry-to-industry level beyond this agreement, and we're told that you would have been consulted or were doing some work on that. Is there anything you can share with us on the progress or status of that work?
Yes, absolutely, Senator, and thank you for the question. I know my colleague Damien Grafante is here, and he's been leading quite a bit of that work, so he may wish to jump in. But there's a few different aspects of it. So, as I mentioned, we are at an introductory point in the relationship with India. For those who aren't aware, the Indian wine market or the Indian wine sector is relatively significant. I don't have the figures in front of me in terms of size, but there is a sort of agro-political dimension and power base there in India that we're well aware of. So we are working to build those relationships with a number of different businesses. There's a couple of different aspects to it. So in addition to the industry-to-industry cooperation that we're working on at the moment, there are some things around testing requirements, for instance, that seem to be gaining some traction. So these are things like ensuring that Australian testing laboratories results can be accepted with ease by Indian importing authorities, and ensuring that there is opportunity there at that sort of technical level as well to utilise some of the great research and development and technical capacity that we have here in Australia to help build that technical capacity in India, because that does really underpin a lot of two-way trade between our two nations. Damien, did you have anything that you would like to add in terms of the sort of the coming trip that you're attending?
Thanks, Lee. There's as has been touched on by a number of the opening statements, there's quite a lot of technical challenges within the Indian market, and as Lee's mentioned, it is quite a new and emerging market. And as Australia, we have a very well-established, very technically proficient, well-regulated wine industry that a lot of the work we're doing in this project is about working with our colleagues in the Indian wine industry and building some of that capacity in the market to help grow the wine category as a whole, and help to streamline some of those challenging technical requirements that are part of that market. What we've been doing is working on, as a starting point, building relations with the Indian wine industry, and also establishing relations between our regulatory authorities, both in Australia and in India. So that's taken the form so far of, as mentioned by Lee, a delegation of Indian industry members. Some of the biggest producers in India came out to our technical conference in June this year. And then we've got this subsequent follow-up visit, which will occur next week, where we'll be attending some of the Indian events with some of our government regulatory authorities as well as the AWRI, who manage a lot of our technical operations. So it's all really focused at this stage on growing that relationship and helping to look at areas where we can work together and build cooperation between the two countries. And it feeds into the work that's been laid down within the ECTA, and hopefully we can build on that through the broader FTA efforts.
Thank you. And I'm not sure if this is one for you, Mr. Griffanti, or for you, Mr. McLean, but I mean, obviously we've had, the quite devastating situation in terms of our trade relationship with China, which had a big impact and is still having a big impact on the Australian wine industry. I'm just interested in your perspective on to what extent, the opportunities, noting that we would like to see them be a bit more expansive, but noting that there are opportunities here for our local industry. To what extent does that resolve some of the, provide some market for lost markets to China? How impactful will it be?
Thank you, Senator. Damien, I'll kick off with this one. I think Byron has outlaid the sort of statistical reality of what these tariff reductions will mean over time. I mean, he's quite right in saying that as it stands, the tariff reductions would only apply to about 2% of Australian wine exports to India. But I will note that that is under the current arrangements. There has been some interest that we've seen in terms of exploring the market in the future, particularly at that premium end. And I note that the South Australian government, for example, has been doing some work in working with some of its higher value producers, for example, in the Barossa Valley, to bring brands into India as a bit of a pathfinder sort of piece of work. Byron's also quite right in saying that as a larger size business, often in these emerging markets, it's the big businesses that need to go in there first and do that work to build the market and build the brand Australia for the rest of the industry. But that does create the opportunity for others to dovetail in after the fact as well. So the opportunities there are really at that higher value end. China was it was a big volume market, of course, but it was also a very high value market. So there were a number of high value producers who were heavily impacted by the closure of the China market and are looking for opportunities to diversify. And we think that the interim agreement provides some level of opportunity, albeit slightly limited and over time. But I think it's a good launch pad for the government to look into starting that renegotiation of a final and more comprehensive agreement.
Yeah. And just to build on that a little bit as well, the China market, the closure of the China market was effectively a $1.2 billion market. There's not a single market that can service that as a whole. India, by its population, has potential in the future to potentially soak up some of that, but there's a range of markets throughout Asia that we're looking at diversifying into. India is just one that has a lot of future potential.
Right, just being mindful of the time, perhaps Senator Smith, if this is your last one, then we'll shift around.
No worries. I'll ask one which I don't think other people are about to ask then. Can I just check, in India, is there a market for low or zero alcohol wine? Are we already exporting those products there? I understand we do a bit in China, but is that a potential growth area too?
Yeah, so yes, it's a really important part of our plans. We actually recently launched Jacob's Creek Unvined, which is an alcohol removed wine into the market. They actually attract a lower tariff as well, which is important. The tariff on the non-alc products are about 30% as opposed to 150. And obviously there is pockets of cultural sensitivity on alcohol in India. So it's an important part of our growth plans and brand building exercise.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think there's variation as well between different states, and there's definitely potential for low and no alcohol product in a market that has traditionally quite high alcoholic beverages and spirits and high alcohol beer. It may be something that could be considered a good opportunity for certain segments of the market.
All right, we're going to go to Mr. Birrell and then Mr. Pike and then Senator Chandler.
Thanks, Chair. I'll direct this question to Mr. McLean, but anyone jump in if you think you've got the answer to it. My understanding is that the sensitivity around this negotiation is where to set the minimum export price. Okay, now everyone in Australia, probably in the industry, wants it 0. It's ended up being 5, but I understand that had it been set at $2 would have really opened some opportunities for the Australian market. And I'm just interested. I understand that the motivation of the Indians and the Indian industry was sort of protectionism, but in discussions with industry members, I understand that a lot of the Indian production is between, if it was to compete, is between the $0 and $2 US dollar a bottle minimum export price, and there's not so much between 2 and 5. So and the added benefit of so I'm just interested in your understanding of the nature of the domestic Indian market and where that's targeted, and how much our $2 to $5 Australian wines would actually compete with that Indian domestic product. And then further to that, is there did the negotiators push hard enough the fact that educating the market to a higher quality product is advantageous to the Indian domestic producers in the long run as well?
Look, thank you very much for the question. I completely understand the reasoning behind it. I think, firstly, it is important to note that you're quite right that I think, in general, Australian producers and Indian producers are playing at different spots in the market. I don't have the statistics in front of me or the data to indicate exactly what sort of shape that takes, but I think part of this industry-to-industry relationship that we're looking to build with our Indian counterparts is to really explain that fact to them, that this isn't a matter of Australia coming in and flooding the market with very, very cheap wine, to put it in those sort of blunt terms. This is about finding room for Indian producers and Australian producers, whether they be at a very high value or at a more normal sort of commercial value rate. So that's the first thing I'll note. In terms of the negotiators, I think the negotiators did a terrific job and did everything in their power to drive the best bargain they could. I've had some involvement in agricultural trade over a number of years in a former role, and I think there was strong recognition over a very long period that doing any sort of deal that touched on agriculture with India was a very, very tough ask. So I think the fact that we're here with this interim agreement is a very good start and a very positive start for Australia. So I think there is a very important educational piece that we need to lead on as an agricultural industry and as a wine industry, and that's certainly going to be part of this work that we're doing in terms of the relationship building exercise with India.
If I may, to add a little bit more colour to Mr. McLean's answer, 70% of wine consumption in India is domestically produced. But when you look at price points, say above 800 rupees, that falls to 1/3. And above about 1,300 rupees, there's basically no domestic produced wine in the marketplace. In terms of sort of where the negotiators got to or didn't get to, they had a pretty hard task there. It is our understanding, though, that the local domestic industry made representations to the Indian government that they were accepting of $3.50 US per bottle as a minimum import price. So I think there's certainly scope to significantly reduce that threshold as part of the final agreement, preferably a fair bit south of $3.50 a bottle, but it does give some context in terms of where the domestic players sit.
Can I just ask a clarifying question on that, Mr. Chair? That the rupee, can you just equate that, do a calculation for us as to where that sits with the US dollar per bottle? The 70% of the Indian market was at, I just didn't catch it, how many rupees and what that equates to as a competitive force?
Yeah, so when I say rupees, I mean the 800 rupee is a retail price, and what we're talking about in terms of the minimum import price is obviously a customs price. So it's really difficult, particularly given the complexities of all the Indian state taxes, which are layered on to, say, a customs price on import, to translate that to a retail price. But I guess that the fundamental point is that domestically produced wines in India tend to play below that 800 rupee retail price. A minimum import price of even $2 a bottle, even if tariffs would go to zero, Australian wines still wouldn't be competing with that domestic production.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Burrell. Mr. Pike.
Thank you, Chair. That was a very good segue because my question is going to be in relation to the state taxes, and I'll aim it at Mr. Hodkinson because your submission has outlined some of these state excises that have been imposed, and some of which seem to be targeting imported wine in particular. What does this agreement mean for those state-based excises? Because it seems to me, from my analysis, that some of these are wine-producing regions within India, and I'm gathering, if I'm reading between the lines correctly, and inform me if I'm not, that these seem to be, in effect, an attempt by these state governments to impose a bit of a leg up for their domestic wine industry. And we're talking about pretty significant, tariffs as well, or pretty significant excises. What does this agreement mean for these state taxes? Does it touch these at all?
Thanks for the question, Mr. Pike. It's a very good one. The short answer is no, it doesn't. So, the example I cited in my opening remarks of Maharashtra having a 150% tax on manufacturing costs on foreign liquor, the agreement doesn't go near it. So we've got a situation where we've got a trade deal with India, doesn't reduce tariffs on 98% of Australian wine exports, and doesn't touch any of the state taxes, which are so burdensome for our products.
And there's also then no guarantee, of course, as to the state may decide to impose larger taxes, or another state might wish to follow suit. So my concern would be that we have an agreement where the federal government has agreed to reduce somewhat tariffs on Australian wines, whereas the states in India may feel that they've got a role to play in giving their domestic industry a leg up.
That would be correct. And I think one of the ambitions that a future negotiation or future agreement should have, certainly from the Australian side, is some sort of safeguarding mechanism. So if there were to be tariff reductions at the federal level, there needs to be some sort of safeguard that prevents the states from a compensating adjustment, if you like, to a net outcome of nil.
Yes, exactly right. But beyond that, I'm noting the concerns in relation to that. I'm just trying to find the the Australian Grape and Wine submission. I note that you've said your recommendation to the committee, and this is perhaps one for you, Mr. McLean. Your recommendation is that we move quickly to ratify this and then just proceed with the negotiations from there.
Yes, that's exactly right, Mr. Pike. I think we do need to lock in this opportunity that we have now. I absolutely recognise that this isn't perfect, and I think that we would have preferred an outcome that was more liberalising. That's fairly obvious, but I think it does provide us an opportunity to use this agreement as a springboard into the next round of negotiations. And perhaps if I can just expand on your question about state taxes and charges. Obviously, there is the religious and cultural sensitivities in India that are going to drive much of those regulatory arrangements and state taxes, including some states that are completely prohibitionist. But what I will say, in those states where there are significant wine markets and high growth opportunities, I think the relationship building process that we are going to be undertaking over the next little while, in a co-investment with government and industry working together to help sort of shape the political environment and help ease into a discussion around what those taxes and charges actually mean and how they can be addressed. So I think there is an opportunity there for that relationship building work to play a part in hopefully reducing some of those taxes and charges in the future.
Excellent. Thanks, Chair. That's all from me.
Thank you, Mr. Pike. Senator Chandler.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for coming along today and providing your testimony. Everyone has spoken a lot about the impact of losing the China market during the pandemic has cost the industry. I think $1.2 billion was thrown around as a number at some point. And I think it's really good that everyone has come to the table and said, look, the ECTA isn't ideal, but it's a launching pad for doing good things in the future. What's the opportunity cost to the industry from now into the sort of short to medium term if we don't try and address some of these issues in future negotiations going forward?
I think from my perspective, if we weren't to address the issues, efficiencies as part of the final agreement, we're not going to remedy the situation that's been triggered by the tariffs out of China. I think other witnesses that are appearing with me have quite rightly pointed that India is not a silver bullet, and we're not going to be able to replace the China market, the perfect trade deal with India. But we're not going to be able to replace the China market without a really good trade deal with India, I guess is my point. There's plenty of other markets where we need to work harder as an industry in developing. And there's some good opportunities, particularly in Southeast Asia. But I think a better trade deal with India is a necessary precondition to remedying the problems that we're experiencing or suffering as a result of tariffs imposed by the Chinese Ministry of Commerce.
Australian grape and wine, did you have any other thoughts on that one?
Yeah, look, just to expand very briefly on what Byron said, I think he's exactly right. I think the opportunity cost of, to be frank, if we don't sort of lock in this agreement now and work to lock in something more comprehensive and liberalising in the future, we'll be looking in 20 years to do this as well, while everyone else has sort of moved into, every other country's been working hard to try to improve the trading environment with India themselves. So I think there is a significant opportunity cost of not ratifying the agreement now. And the opportunity on the flip side, if we can get this right, and if we can really deliver a truly liberalising agreement in the future, I think some of the issues around structural oversupply that we're facing in our sector at the moment, like Byron mentioned, grape prices and grape growers not picking fruit. These are all realities that we're going to see playing out over the coming vintage, unfortunately. So there is a real opportunity there for us to help alleviate some of the worst of those impacts of the closure of the China market. But having said that, of course, we want to see a much more liberalised agreement in the future with better conditions. But equally, there are opportunities with this interim agreement at that higher value end as well that we'd like to see. We'd like the ability for our members to take advantage of.
Mm-hmm. And Mr. McLean, what are the main wine regions that we're seeing suffering from the oversupply issue at the moment?
Thank you for the question. It's a very good one. By way of context, well over 90% of our exports to China were red wine, and predominantly Shiraz and Cabernet. So it is those red wine regions that are most affected. So you've got areas like the Barossa Valley, for example, McLaren Vale. they are getting through this to some extent because they have a really well-known and well-established sort of level of brand cachet in Australia. And they have an ability to sort of diversify perhaps more easily than some other regions. But areas like Langhorne Creek, Pad the Way, and the three inland growing areas of the Riverina, the Riverland, and the Murray Valley, I think they are all feeling the pinch.
Thank you very much. That's all from me, Chair.
Thanks, Senator Chandler. So I think for the final question, Senator O'Neill.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I think I just waited for the perfect moment there because we have just put on the record the New South Wales wine growing areas. Don't want it all just to be South Australia. I do know Tasmania's got a pretty good crop as well.
I'm always forced to stay quiet as the West Australian here, but that's...
Yeah, no, it's great. I mean, the Margaret River Valley. Oh, is it a valley? No, it's just Margaret River, isn't it?
Just Margaret River.
But the Riverina, I'm very pleased, got to mention, it's a really significant issue. And I think for the line of the day, Mr. Graffanti, you talked about India soaking up the wine that China aren't taking on board. I thought that was just a beautiful turn of phrase. I hope that can happen, and I'm excited by people's general support for advancing this agreement in its interim status, and I hear what you're saying about moving forward. My question goes to the associated Labor concerns. We want a long-term, really high-quality relationship with India as our Quad partner. We don't want to see the mistakes that have sadly been reported over the years in terms of inadequate support for students and the concerns that have been constantly raised in the Education and Employment Committee in the Senate over the last 6 years with regard to the quality of work and certainty of fair pay for farm workers in this country. So all of those things will factor into our relationship with India. I'd like to ask the sector, if you can't provide a response today on notice, what is the industry's commitment to the people of India that in bringing a workforce to Australia, which is really important for our industry, that there will be the development of proper processes to ensure fair and equal pay, same pay for the same work for Indian nationals who come and help us generate this long-term sustainable trade in wine with our Quad partner?
That's an excellent question, Senator. Thank you very much for asking it. I may have to get back to you on notice on some of the detail, but what I will say is that the concerns around the availability of labour in our sector and other parts of the agriculture sector are pretty well known. We see real opportunity here in this agreement, whether it's part of it or something that is associated with the agreement in the future to perhaps undertake a lot of training in terms of helping the Indian industry to build capacity, whether it be in winemaking, viticultural practices, or what have you. We've got some of the best technical R&D and educational facilities in the world here in Australia, and we'd very much like to be doing that. In terms of the worker safety, we are absolutely committed to making sure that our members are doing the right thing by their workers. It's the right thing to do. We know how important it is. We have had some conversations in the past with the industry about the importance of doing this, particularly as it relates to things like labour hire companies and the like, which have been the subject of some media interest in the past. But perhaps, Senator, if you don't mind, I might take that on notice and get back to the committee with a little bit more detail, if that's okay.
That'd be great. And if you don't have a formalised response yet, can I just suggest that, it would be really good to see such a significant industry that carries Australia brand to really show leadership with regard to, leading as a sector in terms of really high quality, secure jobs for people at all levels of the industry, whether you're out there literally on the ground picking the fruit or you're engaging in a viticulture development course.
Yes, and maybe if I could just expand on that very quickly as well. I mean, I think it's important to note that when we talk about the wine industry, I often sort of also talk about other regional industries in Australia's 65 wine regions. So it's not just grape growing and winemaking. It's the people working in cellar doors. It's the people working in local restaurants and pubs and accommodation venues as well. It's all part of that package that the wine industry sort of relies on, and part of the contribution that we make to those regional economies. So having a secure workforce is absolutely critical to making that work. But we'll get something to you to the committee in due course.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Considering the time, thank you all of you for your attendance here today. If you've been asked to provide any additional information, as was just discussed, would you please forward it to the Secretary within 7 working days? As I said at the opening, it is the responsibility of witnesses to meet the deadline in a timely manner. You'll get a copy of the transcript of your evidence as soon as it becomes available, and have an opportunity to request corrections to transcription errors. But thank you for your submissions and your attendance here today.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you.
All right. I now welcome the Australian Council of Trade Unions to give evidence today. For the Hansard record, will you please state your full name and the capacity in which you appear before the committee?
Thank you, Chair. My name is Ben Moxham. I'm the Director of Legal and Policy here at the Australian Council of Trade Unions.
Thank you, Mr Moxham. Although the committee doesn't require you to give evidence under oath, I should advise you that this hearing is a legal proceeding. The Parliament therefore has the same standing as the proceedings of the respective houses. That means the giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as a contempt of Parliament. The evidence you give today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege. I invite you to make a brief opening statement before we proceed to discussion.
Thank you very much, Chair. And firstly, I acknowledge that I'm coming to you from the lands of the Wurundjeri people here in Melbourne at ACTU headquarters. And thanks for the opportunity to give evidence today on the interim trade agreement with India. Unions support trade, but especially trade that is fair, trade that can ensure that workers on all sides of any trade agreement can enjoy work that is secure and well paid. I also want to acknowledge that this agreement does provide important additional access for, in particular, Australian farmers, miners, and some improvements in services, and do recognise that and the efforts of the negotiators. I just want to touch on briefly in introductory remarks just six concerns we have with the agreement, many of which are called with the new government's positions, and I'll just touch on them very briefly, and if the committee wants to ask for more detail, I'm more than happy to provide it. Firstly, there is no independent impact assessment undertaken for this agreement. I note that this is a recommendation of this committee a couple of years ago that this would be good practice and best practice. We know that trade liberalisation can have profound economic impacts, in particular workers in communities that could be left on the scrap heap unless those potential risks are taken into account. A proper impact assessment can really help you understand them. When you go into negotiations, it can help you eliminate them, mitigate them, or deal with them afterwards. So that's something we'd call for. Secondly, this agreement was very much negotiated in secret without input from unions and from civil society. We have a lot of, trusted allies, trading partners that have much better processes that respect the input of unions and civil society that we urge the committee to consider in its own recommendations. It could be the UK, the US, the EU, Canada, for example. Thirdly, just on trade in services, we really don't want provisions in trade agreements that might lock in or restrict the ability of governments at all levels to regulate in the public interest. That might be, unpicking a privatisation or putting in place better regulation in the public interest. Having a very careful look at the services chapter, there's a number of concerns, but we need to probably dig into them a bit more. One is that, there is a carve out that our system of professional recognition, qualifications and licensing is very much protected from commitments in the trade agreement, but it's not clear that if we improve them over time, we add to them, we change them, that is indeed protected in the way that it is in our trade agreement with the UK, for example. So there's areas there that we urge the committee to look into. Fourthly, on migration, and I caught the tail end of the previous session. For us, we don't think this has a place in a trade agreement of this nature. If it's going to be in trade, it should be a specialist, standalone, purpose-built agreement or scheme, similar to the Pacific Labour Mobility Scheme, which we think does have important safeguards and considerations, picking up on what the Senator mentioned earlier. We also think that there's a really important national conversation and consensus emerging across government, across industry, across unions about what we should do with migration, and that is, improve pathways to permanency, proper, genuine assessments of skill shortages that look to fill skills locally, and then temporary migration, on a more measured basis. But then also importantly, the safeguards to make sure a lot of the scandals and abuses don't happen. Good intentions will not stop the systematic exploitation of temporary overseas workers. So when trade agreements start to carve out exceptions, it's like so many termites, attacking a system that everyone wants to build. We acknowledge that the commitments in this interim agreement are fairly modest, but they add to the pile of termites that we say will undermine our a fair and proper migration system. Fifthly, we welcome the lack of investor state dispute settlement provisions in this text. We hope that's a deliberate decision on behalf of the government and DFAT, and not just because they ran out of time negotiating this agreement before the election. Words from J. Scott supporting that position would be welcome. And then fifthly and finally, there is no chapter on labour or environmental standards. We think this is a missed opportunity for the government to really have an honest dialogue with India about lifting its performance on labour standards. It has not ratified fundamental conventions on freedom of association, the right to organise, the right to collective bargaining. So, to take it to its extreme, that means there's no international commitment for India to even let an organisation like the ACTU or its affiliated unions actually exist. Just final remarks. I know most trade agreements that come before JSCOT are really offered to you guys on a take it or leave it basis. I think this situation is different. It's an interim agreement. There's commitments by the new government to negotiate a comprehensive one. So we think a lot of the concerns we raised, if they're framed within recommendations from this committee, can send a strong signal to the Australian government to pick up on those. So you do have an excellent chance to influence the final outcome in this case. I'll leave it there, Chair, and see if there's any further questions on that or any other point.
Thank you, Mr. Moxham. I'll kick off, and I'm sure there'll be others who want to jump in. But thanks for that run through of some issues. You may have noted earlier. I mean, as you say, this committee's taken interest in the question of independent economic analysis and improvements to consultation over a period of time. We did note that, unlike the Australia-UK agreement, there isn't, as part of this preliminary agreement, even a trade data sharing side letter, but the department confirmed that the intention is that there be such an arrangement in relation to the fuller version of a trade agreement, if and when we get to that. But I'll just ask you to expand on what you said about trade in services. Particularly, I mean, as you note, commonly and sensibly, we seek to ensure that, notwithstanding commitments we make through trade agreements, we don't impair the ability of government to provide public services and to regulate in the national interest and in the broad interest of the Australian community. The point you've made, if I understand it, is that whilst those carve-outs exist in this agreement, they're not explicit with respect to what might be future changes. So they're kind of like a steady state carve-out, and that they may leave open the potential that if there were sort of future changes, that they would perhaps be challenged through an agreement like this. So I just invite you to say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, happy to. And I imagine trade lawyers might disagree or have an argument about this, which for my mind is the case about where we need clarity on this question. So within Annex 8F in the Trade in Services chapter, which is about our non-conforming measures, Part A spells out those non-conforming measures that we list that are effectively frozen in time, whereas Part B is those measures where we might look to add to them, improve them over time. So within Part A, paragraph 4, there is an important paragraph which I mentioned in my opening remarks about, qualification requirements, technical standards, authorisation requirements and licensing requirements. It's really about making sure that people have, the appropriate skills and good character to do a lot of this work. That will no doubt constantly be reviewed and need to improve over time. A really good example would be, the Royal Commission into Aged Care, which reported last year and talked about the need to, professionalise what really is an industry in crisis across a range of occupations. We would not want to see a trade agreement, inadvertently freeze that process when we know so much more work needs to be done to, invest in careers and support that with proper, qualifications framework. So I think that's one area we'd like to look at. We notice, I think I mentioned in my opening remarks, that the UK FTA has that clause, but in the Part B bit, so it's much more explicit about, we can improve this over time.
So can I clarify?
Yeah, look, I'll ask Senator O'Neill just to jump in on this particular point.
I just want to ask, to clarify for me, your main concern about the way that is constructed is it's not dynamic, that it is a moment in time fix and it requires a shift to reflect other documents that allow for more dynamism in that regard. Yep,
That's
okay,
right, exactly.
thank you.
Yep.
Right. Thank you.
Yep.
I mean, with respect to trade and services and Chapter 8, it's been raised for a separate submission that with respect to protecting Australian public services and the way that they're excluded, that relies on a definition of public services, which is termed in the following way: services carried out in the exercise of governmental authority, neither on a commercial basis nor in competition with other service providers. And the point that's been made to us is that in some cases these days, public services are occasionally expected to or encouraged to participate in open tender processes where it may be that a public service entity provides that service, but it may be that a private entity does, and that definition opens the potential for public services to not be protected, even to the extent that this agreement states. So I'm not sure if that's something you've turned your mind to.
It is, and that's a shared concern of ours, which we've included in our written submission. We think that definition is ambiguous, especially in the context where so many government services can be in competition. There's a few aged care, home care examples, for example, in the state of Victoria where I am. So we would like a clearer, tighter definition there for sure.
Okay. I'll just ask one more question, then I'm going to go to Mr. Pike. On the point you made about labour access, and it is always worth acknowledging that while the shorthand that we all use when we're discussing these kinds of agreements is trade agreements, but they're not just trade agreements, they're trade and investment agreements, and then they encompass a range of other things. And the suggestion that you made, Mr. Moxham, that it would be open for any government to deal with labour market access completely separately, and we do that in some cases. And certainly it's been raised with us before that the United States, for example, never contemplates labour market arrangements through its trade and investment agreements. But what do you think would represent a better way of dealing with this, as opposed to the sort of the bits and pieces approach that seems to happen as we progress various bilateral arrangements over time? What could you imagine would be a way of looking at the bigger picture in a way that's more organic and integrated?
Well, I think a couple of things. I think the Job Summit made important progress on getting national consensus about how do you design a modern migration system, especially given the pressures in the labour market, post-pandemic. And that's looking at, a genuine assessment of skill shortages, where there is an acknowledgement across the board that sometimes we've put temporary migrant workers in place because the skills system has had underinvestment or a lack of coordination. So, the new government's committed to setting up Jobs and Skills Australia to help provide a more robust and genuine assessment of skills. So if you then include particular occupations in a trade agreement, which this interim agreement does, you're effectively bypassing that whole system, which is trying to fix up that fundamental problem. There's also a range of other safeguards, for example, labour market testing, which is I don't think anyone gets wildly excited by it, but we now have 8 or 9 agreements that have exemptions from labour market testing, yet everyone else in the world will probably have to adhere to it. There needs to be a conversation about how to make that fit for purpose, but it's like the system is now a bit like Swiss cheese, so it's just unhelpful. I think so there's the national conversation, but I also mentioned the Pacific Labour Mobility Scheme, where having a purpose-built, effectively multilateral agreement where countries can kind of sign on is a better way of dealing with this, I think, than a standalone trade agreement, because it's thinking through all of the safeguards you need to make sure that workers are respected, that they can be productive, that they can be fairly remunerated. So that's around planned inductions, that's around safeguard protections for whistleblowers or those who are on employment-sponsored visa arrangements. It's also about better penalties where temporary overseas workers are the victims of wage theft. The Migrant Workers Centre recently published a survey showing that 2/3 of temporary overseas workers are the victims of wage theft. So deal with that in a really strong scheme where everyone's behind it, supports it, wants to make it work. You're not going to deal with it in a detailed, buried chapter within a trade agreement that just does not have those considerations or the infrastructure to make sure that migrant workers are fairly respected.
Thank you. Mr. Pike?
Thank you, Chair. My question relates to the point, I think it was the second or third point you raised in relation to the approach to consultation throughout the process of reaching this agreement. We've heard evidence this morning from the department around the length and the approach to consultation, both from when this process began back in 2011, then when it was paused, obviously, and then back to the final stages of it now, including public consultation period, etc. You've described the process as undemocratic in your submission. And we've heard from other stakeholders which were quite supportive of how the government went about doing this. I'd be keen to hear from you in terms of what was the level of your consultation and why is it that you seem to be out of your position seems to be at contradicting what the department has put to us and what the other stakeholders have said.
Our involvement in this one would have been I'd have to check, but probably at best a departmental briefing on some top lines, a chance to put views, but no understanding of what's on the table, what's not on the table, what the particular details are. I need to check the records. I suspect we've had no such consultation with the department. So our main engagement is to see a press release, a final text, and then no way to have any real input into that. I know that having spoken to friends and colleagues across industry and the private sector, there is a much more intense discussion, engagement, negotiation with DFAT because they've got particular commercial interests around access, and so there's naturally more of a back and forth. On the issue of out of step, we just look at the processes in the way that the European Union does it, the United States does it, to some extent the UK and Canada, where civil society and unions are brought into the tent. That's on the understanding that they respect sensitivity around negotiations. There are mechanisms to ensure that respect is in place, and then to actually provide genuine, helpful input is with a bit more trust there. So there are other models there that we'd urge the committee to consider, and I know you have in the past and recommended that. So urge you to look back into that.
Thank you, Mr. Moxham. I don't have any other questions. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Pike. Mr. Birrell?
Yeah, just a question, just a very broad question generally about just subject to the concerns that you've listed, do you support generally the ratification of this free trade agreement in broad terms and the concept of free trade agreements generally? Has your organisation got a position on that more generally?
On the first point, I've outlined a number of deficiencies with the agreement. We don't have a definitive ACTU position on the question of ratification. I do emphasise though that I think the committee has a real chance to influence the ongoing negotiations for a comprehensive agreement. The ACTU certainly supports trade and trade that is fair, and I think the concerns we've outlined could easily be addressed. They are addressed by other countries in other contexts, and so we would see that as beneficial. Like, we're in no doubt that Australian workers can benefit significantly from trade liberalisation done well. We don't shy away from that, but there are concerns that we've outlined here.
Okay, I suppose I'll just follow up by saying that and I accept your answer, but there are, this committee hears from stakeholder groups and they come and say, we support the ratification of the free trade agreement, but these are our concerns. So I'm just wondering if your position was that defined, and it sounds like it's not. And then just when you say trade liberalisation, you support that, and I suppose I'm trying to say, do you see free trade agreements as a key part of trade liberalisation, or do you see them as very different?
I acknowledged and welcomed at the start the improved access under this agreement. So, and one example I'll also give is that we've done work with the Business Council of Australia about how to build a really strong export industry in renewable energy, which has a massive potential in the coming decades. And that is all about exports that will drive good, decent jobs back home. So, massively important role for trade. Back to the first point around ratification, this really goes to the process of negotiations and why we say at the moment it is unfair that we hear nothing about the agreement. It's dumped on us in secret, and then the question is, do you want to take it or leave it? So we would much rather see, and I think the committee has agreed with this in the past, effectively a negotiating mandate tabled in Parliament saying, these are our objectives, these are our red lines, this is what we're going to look for. Here's an impact assessment that's done independently, that's consulted with stakeholders around the parameters of what's going to be negotiated and what sort of impact that might have. Then throughout the process, the EU would consult on particular issues, they'd have discussion papers, you'd have input at that stage. And so put all that together, and by the time the final agreement comes out, you're going to get a much stronger consensus across civil society, trade unions and industry, rather than being offered things on a difficult take it or leave it basis.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Burrell. Mr. Moxham, I guess I'll just conclude by asking you to comment on an issue that's been raised, and it goes to that question of temporary foreign labour access. And most people start from the point of view that there's a place for that in the way things work, and Australia benefits from it. In fact, I think the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry was really pointing to that. Like, some people would see that as a concession, something that we provide in order to perhaps get a tariff reduction, considering we're mostly tariff-free as it is. But of course, there are benefits to us that derive from being able to deal with skill shortages and these other kinds of things. At the same time, there are risks. There are risks to the way that when it's done badly, undermines the opportunity for Australians to seek work, and perhaps undermines paying conditions in existing industries. There are also risks to people coming into Australia if the proper protections don't exist, because we know that those people are often quite vulnerable. To what extent, and this may not be seen like committee members have put it quite properly to different parts of industry, that whilst they welcome the ability to have temporary foreign labour, there's a responsibility that they have to ensure that it happens properly and safely for those workers, and this contemplates people coming from India. But to what extent does the ACTU end up taking responsibility and having to undertake itself protective actions in relation to temporary foreign labour and the risk that people from other countries are exploited while they're working in Australia?
When you say the ACTU taking protective actions, how do you mean? Sorry.
Well, the ACTU and or your your member unions, that they effectively end up being part of the framework that is trying to prevent wage theft or trying to prevent exploitation, even though it's, in some cases, it may not be the case that people who come in under a temporary labour arrangement happen to be members of this or that union. But obviously it is the labour movement here that is often at the front line of that protective effort.
Absolutely, and that's what drives our policy positions, the solutions we're advocating for. If you have a good union presence in a workplace, if you're able to run inductions, we've got a lot of great stories of, which we actually raised at the Job Summit, of temporary migrant workers exploited, that they found that they bumped into the union, they joined the union, and then they've turned around, the practices and cultures in the workplace or a particular part of the industry. I think it's just the scale of the issue. So that's why we've supported something like the Pacific Labour Mobility Scheme, where you can get all the industry together, all the unions together, and think about, well, systematically, how can we reduce the vulnerability facing temporary overseas workers? It's not enough. Good intentions has not worked in the last 15 years, 20 years. So inductions, better safeguards, which is what the Migrant Worker Task Force called for, and what this government's committed to. Easier, quicker ways to chase up unpaid wages, and that would include stronger rights for workplace delegates who want to help take that action. So it's a big puzzle, but we think we can make significant progress. We do think there is a role for temporary overseas workers. We're not opposing that. We think the role, though, is about filling those skill shortages that can genuinely not be filled through local efforts, and we think those using that labour should provide a genuine contribution to investing in the skills system, and the temporary migrant workers should have stronger paths to permanency, and that the sponsorship arrangements shouldn't make them so vulnerable. So we're pitching ideas around industry sponsorship, for example. Sorry, that's a long answer to a difficult issue.
No, I appreciate it, and it's true. I'm sure it's something we'll continue to look into and work. And we know that it's not just about the rights and protections for individual workers, but for Australia, it's a matter of our obligation to partner countries and a matter of our international reputation, because we've found in the past that in relation to international students in particular, when that isn't done well, the impacts are lasting. Just a final question or point from Senator O'Neill.
Thank you very much. Amongst the many documents that we've been provided here is a regulation impact statement, final pass assessment 28 March 22. I'm just wondering if you've had a chance to look at that, Mr. Moxham.
Not in enough detail, to be honest, but the point we make is independent. So we want to see an independent assessment that goes in detail to costs and benefits. And having worked in the EU system for the British unions, I've seen those sort of assessments that say, look, we're about to cut a trade deal with this country. Here's the particular occupations, communities, industries that are going to be threatened by what's on the negotiating table. How do we deal with that? So that's the sort of information we're going to have to feed into negotiations. Whereas a lot of the stuff that DFAT have done in-house are really about some fairly top-level number crunching around, benefits, without a more nuanced understanding of the impact of trade.
Thank you for that. Just on that document, basically to support, I think, what you've been saying here, page 60 of the document, point 212 through to at the end of 215, just a few very, very short chapters that just summarise at extremely high level the issues around labour. So I think that they make that point. I also just think it's important, having read your submission, to put on the record that there is no ambiguity in my reading of your document of the support for the trade union movement, for the development of the wealth of this nation. Indeed, you say having a strong export sector is imperative for Australia's prosperity. So I just think it's important to put any doubt about that to bed. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. And I think the academic literature is almost at a consensus that in most cases, trade liberalisation can result in overall economic gains for a country, but it can also result in very specific pain for particular workers or communities if those impacts are not either mitigated, eliminated, or properly dealt with through, transition support and planning. So
that's why we need Jobs and Skills Australia.
Absolutely.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you.
So with your guidance of the Chair, there's some statements being made. I'd like to make one myself and just put it to the witness and generally, Mr. Moxham. But my experience is that whilst there are experiences of exploitation, I think it gets overblown. I think in general, people are treated well in agriculture, particularly as agriculture modernises and more high-tech agricultural workforce is needed. I think the industries themselves have done a good job, and I'm not saying that there isn't a strong place for regulatory authorities. But I think when the word systematic gets used about exploitation of foreign workers in Australia, I think it's an overblown comment, and B, I think it prevents people from overseas coming here and getting good jobs, which would further their lives, and in some cases their communities back home. I'd just like to put that on the record as my experience, and if you want to comment on that, Mr. Moxham, feel free.
Oh, look, I would love for Australia to be able to say to the world, this is a great place to work. If you look at the Migrant Worker Task Force report and a range of inquiries, there's just too many heartbreaking stories, and there's a range of really positive recommendations that I think we can all get behind to really turn this around. And I know that the new government's committed to many of those.
Yeah, and there's no equivalent of what we do in Australia in the EU and the OECD countries. So there's plenty of room for improvement. As much as, I see fantastic businesses right across the regions of Australia and really good people with good heart, Mr. Birrell, I absolutely acknowledge that. But the scale of, nearly over 100,000 undocumented workers as a shadow workforce in this country is a blight on us. It needs to be fixed. I think we cannot deny that exists. It's a matter of public record now, and it's an opportunity, I think, in negotiation with India to actually make sure that we commit to making sure that their citizens are safe.
And I just re-emphasise my point that the word systematic is a blight on many of those businesses, and I think that we should be careful with the language we use about those experiences.
Thank you. I think we're refining views within the committee stage now. Yeah. But I thank you, Mr. Moxham, for your attendance here today. If you've been asked to provide any additional information, please forward it to the Secretary within 7 working days, because it is the responsibility of witnesses to meet the deadline in a timely manner. You will be sent a copy of the transcript of your evidence when it becomes available, and have an opportunity to request corrections to transcription errors. But we thank you for the ACTU's submission and your attendance today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
I now welcome the Australian Fair Trade and Investment Network to give evidence today. For the Hansard record, would you please state your full name and the capacity in which you appear before the committee? If you can. I know we've just informed committee members that there's a little bit of an IT issue, so I'm not sure that we have... Oh, here we go. You just need to take yourself off mute. I think you've gone on and off mute. No, we're still not hearing you, Dr. Reynolds. Okay, we've just got you now. So please, your name and the capacity in which you appear before the committee.
My name's Patricia Murray Ranald, and I'm the convener of the Australian Fair Trade and Investment Network.
Thank you, Dr. Ranald. Although the committee doesn't require you to give evidence under oath, I advise you this hearing is a legal proceeding of the Parliament, therefore has the same standing as proceedings of the respective houses. The giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as a contempt of Parliament. The evidence you give today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege. I invite you to make a brief opening statement before we proceed to discussion.
Thank you, and I'd like to acknowledge that I'm here on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation in Sydney. This interim agreement as we've heard, mostly deals with tariff reductions and issues to do with trade, goods and services. And within the 14 chapters, there are many issues left open to further negotiation. The process for the last stage of this interim agreement, when the interim agreement was actually being negotiated in detail, didn't involve there was very little public consultation with civil society organisations, and the text wasn't released until after it was signed. And there's been no independent evaluation of social costs and benefit of the agreement. But we do note that there is a commitment in the interim agreement to flexible negotiations about the content of this agreement when the comprehensive agreement is being negotiated. And so that means the comprehensive agreement changes to the interim agreement as recommended in our submission. So I'll just briefly go through some of our concerns. The first to relate to the Trade in Services chapter. The regulation of services is treated like a tariff to be frozen at current levels and reduced in future. And this is qualified by exemptions, which are listed in Annex AF, which do enable the exempted services to be regulated. But there are two parts to Annex 8F. Part A is forms of regulation that can be retained or frozen but not increased in future, and Part B lists those forms of regulation which can be increased in future. Governments have to be very careful to list all the exemptions that they really want to include. So we've got two concerns. The first one is that all existing state government non-conforming regulation in previous agreements, all existing state government non-conforming regulation has been exempted, but that blanket exemption doesn't apply in this agreement. So our first recommendation is that there should be a careful review of state government regulation to ensure that all the exemptions that should have been included have been included. The second issue with Annex 8F is that there is an exemption relating to qualifications, technical standards and licensing requirements, and these are the kinds of things that apply in the aged care industry. And Annex 8 has a Part A which refers to existing regulation, and there is an exemption for that kind of regulation included in Annex A, but it's not included in Annex B, which applies to future regulation. So in our view, it makes no sense to exempt existing regulation on licensing qualifications and service standards and the rules, but not exempt from such rules future increases in regulation required by government policy, like the Royal Commission on Aged Care, which is still in the process of being exempted. And we note that in the UK FTA, both current and future forms of regulation in this area were excluded. So we're asking for which applies, which makes sure that in Part B, this exemption is included so that future regulation in areas like aged care is excluded from the rules of the agreement. The third specific thing I want to say is about the temporary movement of people, and noting that we support Australia's permanent migration. We note that there's no overall removal of labour market testing. We support the use of temporary workers if there is a genuine shortage based on local labour market testing. There hasn't been in this agreement a general exemption from labour market testing, but there are a number of specific arrangements for increases in temporary workers. And we're asking again that in the review of this agreement or in the renegotiation of the comprehensive agreement, these provisions should be removed to ensure that they are actually consistent with current government policy, which puts an emphasis on a more holistic approach to labour market needs and not just relying on temporary migrant workers without testing whether there's actually a genuine labour shortage. We also recommend that a comprehensive agreement should include chapters on enforceable labour rights and environmental standards, and also deals with gender rights, Indigenous rights. And we're going to make a full submission to DFAT on the comprehensive agreement. We would also be recommending that we exclude ISDS. And in terms of the current government's policy for comprehensive and more democratically accountable processes, we support a more open process which has been recommended by this committee, and which should include things like release of negotiating text and regular reports to the Parliament during the negotiations, release of the final text of the agreement for public and parliamentary discussion before signing, and independent evaluation of the agreement, both its economic costs and benefits, but also its social impacts. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Dr. Ranald. I'd like to come to a couple of the things that you've said. The remarks or the points made in relation to Chapter 8 and trade in services. I think it's a significant point that you've made, and I guess I just ask you to expand on it. What you've essentially put in your submission and here today is that there's part of Chapter 8, the Annex 8A, that deals with sort of carve-outs or protections for certain public services or rules and regulations in the delivery of public services that are protected as they are, but that can't effectively be evolved, or that seems to be the way that it might operate, that if there was some desire to make changes off the back of something like the Royal Commission into Aged Care, that could be prevented as between Australia and India, or an Indian-based service provider, and you've suggested that is actually different. The way that is put or structured is different in this agreement when compared to the agreement between Australia and the UK, which this committee is also considering. So do you want to just clarify that?
Yeah, we welcomed the fact that in the Australia-UK FTA, there was a clear exemption in Annex 8A for all things to do with licensing qualifications and service standards. And it was that Annex 8A refers to, Annex 8A has a Part A and a Part B. So the exemption for qualifications, licensing and service standards was not only in Part A, which refers to current regulation, but was also in Part B, which refers to future regulation, to governments being able to change regulation to make it stronger in future. Now, we welcomed that in the UK FTA because it protected a situation like the Aged Care Royal Commission, where there's clearly a process going on of improving regulation into the future. This could apply to a number of other service areas as well. We're frankly surprised that those two, Part A and Part B, were not replicated in this agreement. Instead, that same exemption is only in Part A for current regulation. It's not in Part B for future regulation. And that's very clear. It's just an omission from the text. We did ask DFAT about why that had occurred, and they couldn't really say at the time that we asked them. This was just after the text was released. So we believe that could be easily remedied in the review in the negotiation of this of the comprehensive agreement. and we would urge the committee to recommend that.
Yeah, I mean, on the face of it, you've raised a very fair point, particularly with respect to the inconsistency, and I'll ask the Secretariat just to note, I think for the committee's benefit, that we should just put that particular issue to the department and ask them to comment on that if that inconsistency exists, as Dr. Reynolds suggests it does, and if so, why? You make the point about I think what can be termed a kind of a negative list approach to the exempting of state regulation rather than a blanket exemption. Is that also different between this agreement and the UK agreement, or is that something that has occurred previously to your knowledge?
That is similar to the UK agreement, but we objected to it in that agreement as well. It's not similar to most other agreements. If you look at the CPTPP or most of our bilateral agreements, they do have a blanket exemption for existing state government regulation. Now, our concern about this is that state governments had to, in a relatively short period of time, over months, provide a list of all possible regulation which needed to be exempted. So what we're asking for is that the government, which is a new government, which has more concern in some of these areas, particularly things like areas of state government regulation which deal with local industry development and so on, which this government has different policies on from the previous government, there should be a careful review done in conjunction with state governments to ensure that everything that has been exempted, that needs to be exempted, has been exempted. And if it hasn't been, then it should be addressed in the negotiations for a comprehensive agreement.
Have you actually seen the lists that the states and territories have provided? Do you have a view about those lists?
Yes, I've read them. But the thing is that they're only the regulations that they've included, so we don't know what isn't included.
No, but I mean, it would be interesting, I would have thought, just as a matter of comparison, to the extent that there's variances between the jurisdictions.
There are variances between the jurisdictions, and I mean, this is another issue. What we're urging is for a review, a careful review, to ensure that, for instance, in areas like some state governments have policies which require, for example, in certain areas that there are requirements to have research and development. If there are investors in certain industries, that research and development be done in that state, or other industry development requirements. So we just want to make sure that everything that has been exempted, that should be exempted, has been exempted.
Okay. And the point that you've made in your submission about the way in which public services are defined, you've raised this question as to whether that definition is really optimal or sufficient, to the extent that it says that a public service will be a service that's neither provided on neither a commercial basis nor in competition with other service providers, where in fact you suggest that in many cases public services are expected to pitch for things or tender for things in competition with other service providers. Is that definition a commonly used definition, or is this something that's now appearing in those terms for the first time?
No, it is a commonly used definition, and we've been objecting to it for many years. The situation can arise where it's not clear whether something is still regarded as a public service and therefore automatically exempted from all of the provisions of the services chapter, or whether it needs to be specifically exempted because it's no longer considered under the definition to be a public service. So we consider that's a dangerous ambiguity.
Okay. Are there other questions from committee members, either online or here?
I was going to ask questions about the
services, but I think they're well and truly
Covered?
done. Thank you.
Happy? Everyone happy? All right. Well, I've got a couple of others then that I'll finish off with. Do you have a view, Dr. Ranald? Obviously, one of the things that occurs under this agreement is some liberalisation as far as facilitating inbound Indian investment. And one of the issues that's been raised with us is whether we, when we're seeking to enable investment in Australia in some key areas, like we would say the development of critical minerals and their products is an emerging area. Well, it's been emerging for some time. Do you have a view about whether or not Australia is able to, or is taking, a sort of a joined up strategic approach to this issue? Because there's an understandable interest in getting more capital into Australia to facilitate that kind of investment, but there's then a question of what the ultimate outcome is. If, for instance, a company based in another country comes and undertakes resource development in Australia, but we don't see processing of that resource in Australia, we don't see manufacturing of that resource, it effectively just goes away again, that won't have the same self-sufficiency and strategic or sovereign benefits that it might otherwise have. Do you think that we're looking at that big picture sufficiently through these kinds of agreements?
Well, I would argue that the current government's commitment to local industry development policy doesn't automatically mean that you can't have foreign investment in local industry, but it should mean that there's a regulatory framework which ensures that, for instance, if the policy of the government is to have local processing of minerals, that can proceed. So my understanding is that the current provisions in the agreement in the trade and service, which are actually in the trade and services chapter because there's no investment chapter, are simply about lifting the threshold for Indian investment in Australia.
The Foreign Investment Review Board threshold.
Yes. So I don't think that would automatically restrict governments from having other regulation that requires other aspects of industry policy to be implemented. And of course, there are national security issues and other issues which the government can take into account. So I'm not sure that this would, just the lifting of the threshold would nullify the government being able to have other sorts of regulations. But I certainly think that this is something that should be addressed in the comprehensive negotiations because, and given that we have a new government, it does have a policy which says that, for instance, it would like there to be more actual processing of minerals in Australia rather than critical minerals rather than just exporting them. Then we've got to make sure that the rules of this trade agreement and other trade agreements don't prevent that.
Yeah, no, it's a fair point. I mean, I hadn't seen, I think those, sometimes there are things called performance requirements that are attached to investments. And I know that in the Australia-UK agreement, we are liberalising that area. We are actually giving up some of those requirements that can go to headquartering or they can go to the presence of executives. They can go to Australian industry participation, various other things. But as you say, in this, which is a preliminary agreement, it's just that FIRB threshold, and presumably that's something that will be dealt with in more detail in the agreement to come. Dr. Ranald, do you have anything else that you would like to draw to our attention?
I don't think so, except that I would urge the committee to make some recommendations about the framework for consultation and participation in the comprehensive agreement. the government does have a policy for a more open framework, so I hope that that framework can be applied in those negotiations.
Yeah, perhaps just to finish on that point, you know, we've had the conversation through the course of, well, more in the context of the Australian-UK agreement. But the difference between consultation and briefings, and we've had some participants in the hearings who are pretty happy about how they've been engaged, and then we've had some who aren't. Perhaps to finish, are you able to just say exactly what engagement you had, and how would you characterise it as being at the briefing end, where you're brought in and sort of told more or less what's going on, as opposed to the consultation end, when you're asked for your views and you feel as if the input you're giving is having an impact or an influence on actual negotiations and their outcomes?
Well, we were only invited to one briefing, which was held in December 2021, and we were just told that there were negotiations going on for an interim agreement, and the government wanted to finish it fairly quickly. The problem with that sort of and very rough indication of some topics of negotiation, that is not consultation or in order to get, what we need is detailed discussion of what is actually being discussed in the text of negotiation, especially in those areas of interest to, for instance, civil society organisations. That's what industry gets. You heard from the wine industry that they had very detailed discussion of what was under negotiation, and they had multiple chances to make detailed comments about that. If you don't get the detailed information of what's in the text, then you can't make the detailed comments about it. For instance, if we'd known that they were
scheduled to be disconnected automatically in 10 minutes. Press start.
Okay.
Sorry, ignore that. You just continue.
Yeah. If we'd known, for example, about that change to Annex 8F, that there was only current regulations about qualifications and licensing, etc., going to be exempted, but not future ones, we would have made very strong submissions against that, but we had no idea that was happening. So it's not really meaningful unless you have detail to what feedback about particular.
Okay, we lost you a little bit there at the end, but I think essentially, well, now we seem to have lost you altogether. Sorry, you're with us. I think the last point you made was essentially.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can. So the last point you were making was just that without the knowledge of what's in it and without being invited to comment on the specifics, it can't ever be considered consultation.
Well, it's not adequate. Yes, that's right.
Yeah, okay. Well, thank you, Dr. Ranald, for your attendance here today and for AFDINET's submission. If you've been asked to provide any additional information, please forward it to the Secretary within 7 working days. It's always the responsibility of witnesses to meet the deadline in a timely manner. You will be sent a copy of the transcript of your evidence when it's available and have the opportunity to request corrections to transcription errors. But again, thanks for your time today.
Thank you.
Committee members, having reached the end of today's witnesses, I declare this public hearing closed.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you all.